Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back. I tried something a little different with the scheduled streaming today. Hopefully that didn't amount to any confusion for anyone watching. Um, we're ready to go. We have some jasmine tea today. That's the that's the flavor of the day. Something chiller, you know. This way, when we get all heated in the debate review, it'll only be coming from me and not the tea. Also a little bit cooler, so easier to drink more quickly. But that said, we got to figure out what we're going to review actually, because I did in fact mentioned that I wanted to do a debate review today, but even I hadn't picked the debate we're actually going to review. So let's do some wheedling about, figure out what it is that I want to review, and we'll get into it, and we'll go as long as we go. Yeah, it's always this classic issue of getting the right browser. Okay. Okay, so let's let's at the very least look at the watch later. See if we have anything cool. Oh, I did see while bouncing around off stream, I did see this spicy titled PragerU video. So, oh, I gotta turn on another fan. Give me 1 second. It's quite warm in here. I did find another PragerU video to go over. So we have that one locked and loaded. I guess I should take this opportunity to remove some of these debates that I've seen already. Let's avoid those. I think I've seen this one. I'm not actually sure. We'll leave it there. This one I only saw half of, but I don't know that I necessarily want to do that to myself again. We'll leave it. We'll leave it just for now. We saw this one already. Uh, we could we could you know what? I kind of want to watch this this cosmic skeptic debate. I have the last time I saw him do a debate was quite a few years ago against a Christian apologist by the name of Frank Turek. He's pretty well known, and we just did a bunch of talking about who I consider like a new wave of online atheists. I guess that's not fully correct because like Aaron Ra and Matt Dillahunty are in a similar era. I'm also gonna open a window, but I'll keep talking to you while I'm at it. Uh, I think Matt Dillahunty and Aaron Ra are like the same internet era at the very least, and they're not as calm as I praised Cosmic Skeptic and Genetically Modified Skeptic for being, but I do really like them, so I wanted to go over it. I have no idea what this debate will end up looking like, and I have no idea who the hell Smokey is. So let's do this one, and if it doesn't seem that interesting, maybe we'll do another one. I do want to I do want to give a little bit of background of Cosmic Skeptic from the little I remember of him. I believe his name is Alex O'Connor, and that's not doxing him. He says it in his videos. He's I don't know where he is in his education. When I used to watch him more, he was a philosophy student and clearly a very smart person with a lot of really interesting ideas, who I think expresses them very well. I expect that he will be, if not is already, considered a great thinker of the time. I really do expect a lot from him. He's a really smart guy, and I look forward to seeing what he does. And we're going to be talking about is veganism morally obligatory. So, I guess we try to be honest about our opinions here and about our positions. Honesty is real big in this channel. So, what is my thought on the matter? There are a few things that go into this, and I'm sure they are going to come up. The first is obviously a philosophical issue, which actually I should add to our concepts because ethics is going to come up a lot, and it would be kind of weird to avoid this idea. And that is the idea. Uh, and this is more like we'll put this like philosophy ethics because it only really applies in that field. But the idea is that ought implies can. Basically, the idea is that well, uh, something a person can only be morally obligated to do something that they are able to do. The importance there is something that's like pretty obvious, but can sometimes be left out of ethical conversations. Basically, just if I say you have a moral obligation to prevent all flooding in the world, that's nice and all, but you are incapable of preventing that, and that obligation really has no weight. This is more just a guideline of if you can't do it, then don't. I mention this because like I couldn't imagine that Alex will fail to reckon with this, but people who literally cannot afford to survive otherwise, like if you're living in a food desert and the only access to food you have could would not be viable to survive on if you kept to a vegan diet, or people who can't, or where like vegan diets are just really expensive if you just can't afford it, or if just you live in a part of the world where maybe for whatever reason you cannot get the kind of nutrients you need from the local agriculture alone, and maybe you'll need to supplement with meat. Like these kinds of things weigh in, and so we're probably not going to be talking about people who are unable to, right? So that's step one. The next step is I view morality a little bit more of a sliding scale than a binaristic thing, and even a moral obligation. Oh, I guess. So there's also a concept in ethics that um, uh, that I'll get into a little bit, but I'm not gonna type out and flesh out here because it would take a little too long. But there's this idea of obligatory versus supererogatory. I don't know how to spell that. Let me look that up real quick. So we're getting into some. Okay, I was pretty off, but not. But I was in the general ballpark. Google could figure it out. I know we're getting like deep into philosophy stuff here already. Already some $5 words here. But it's pretty simple. There's the concept of something being obligatory it generally means to say that if you don't do it, it would be bad. Whereas the supererogatory would be maybe you're not required to do it, but it would be nice if you did. A really good example for most people is something like charity. It's nice if you give to charity and people would consider it good, but if you don't, most people wouldn't consider you like an awful person, depending of course on your circumstance, right? If you have, for example, billions of dollars and you let people live in poverty and without the ability to feed themselves, like maybe charity would be at the least you could do. Oh, sorry, I just had to stretch. I don't know, just came up. Oh, I guess it's reversed. So the the eat the rich on my shirt is backwards. But that's what my shirt is. Eat the rich. Uh, Another thing we'll certainly get into past that, but I want to be clear this is not an incitement to violence. But yeah, this is going to come up as well. What do we? So the phrasing is one where you have to assume also. Well, I shouldn't say you have to assume. I think this is not the phrasing of this topic isn't coming from someone who's necessarily very not necessarily thinking of it in philosophical terms like supererogatory versus obligatory. If we are like maybe they're just saying like it's good to do. But with the actual terminology, we were saying it's not just good if you do it, but not doing it is bad. Obviously, if you can't, then don't. You can't. It's not. You can't be obliged to do something that you're incapable of doing. But then the question is it obligatory? I I think of morality as a bit of a sliding scale, a bit of a continuum, and where certain things are on that continuum, and like where points of obligatory versus supererogatory uh, are a little fuzzy for me. And I know this sounds like I'm dodging the question a little bit. I would argue that eating a vegan diet is better than not eating a vegan diet at a minimum. It causes less suffering in the world, not just because like factory farms, but in general, the meat you eat comes from living creatures. Now, of course, there's a little bit of a confounding variable there. If we, as a species, are able to make synthetic meats that don't come from harming animals, I think there's no problem. And I think Alex would agree. Oh, by the way, I already know Alex eats. I don't already know Alex is vegan. I've seen one of his videos where he talks about it. Um, at least I think, if I'm incorrect, we'll modify what we say about it. But I'm sure Alex would understands that this is the reason why it would be bad to eat meat is because it causes harm, and would likely agree that if all meat came from synthetic meat that caused no harm to living creatures in their creation, uh, then eating meat in that case would be fine, and it would shine a light a little bit on the what makes meat eating a little bit, or I shouldn't say a little bit, but makes eating meat harmful. If you had the option to eat synthetic meats and instead were to eat non-synthetic meats, you were to, for example, kill a chicken and eat the meat from that, you can see that there's a harm done to the world where it isn't needed, right? And this is kind of what veganism, like the veganist position, is rooted on. At least that's my understanding. While I am not myself vegan, in part because it would be it just a difficulty that I would have to overcome, and uh, and it is expensive. I wouldn't currently be able to afford it. I do recognize that if I did eat vegan, I would be doing less harm in the world and be that much better a person if we want to think of it in those terms. Uh, but whether it's obligatory, there are a lot of factors that can weigh into that, and I think it depends a lot on the person in the current time that we're in. As much as it's possible to minimize your meat eating, that is good, and that is also something. These are all things I'm pretty sure Alex would agree with, for what it's worth. So I guess we're coming in on Alex's side, but there are reasonable arguments about, well, what do we mean by obligatory, and to what groups of people? If you say to the totality of humanity, I couldn't justify that in large part because too many people are not able to to eat a vegan diet. It's just not something that they either have access to or could afford, or yada yada, etc. We went over all this. But for people who can, I would say, yeah, I guess it ought to be considered obligatory. Maybe I'm wrestling a little bit. I'll be honest. I'm wrestling a little bit because while I want to say it would be obligatory, I am not comfortable condemning in moral terms people who could afford to eat vegan and don't. I'm not, and maybe this is something that I have to think about more. Maybe I'm being a little inconsistent here. I think and maybe it's because of the stark nature of obligatory and moral condemnation. I think I would prefer to say, but this might just be avoiding the issue entirely. I think I would prefer to say, in in as much as a person who can afford to be vegan eats meat or meat byproducts, they are doing more harm than they would if they didn't. It would be better if they reduce that, especially to the point of non-consumption. And maybe I've answered the question without answering it. Maybe I've avoided answer the question in that way. I'm open to being criticized on that angle. There is simply a part of me that I'm trying, again, trying to be honest about, that I am not comfortable with. For maybe this is merely on an emotional level. Maybe I'm merely, this is just my bias coming out. There's a part of me that's not fully comfortable with a condemnation in that way. I suppose you could also argue that humans are omnivores uh, by biological design. Now, while that being a natural thing to eat meat would not make it justified, just because something is natural doesn't make it good. Animals kill each other all the time, and I don't know that we'd necessarily say that like killing is necessarily good because it's natural, or freezing to death is good because that's natural, things like this. But I would say that there is a component to our biology that necessitates, at the very least, compensating for the expectation of meat in our diet and the proteins that we would get from it. This, of course, is circumnavigated by the fact that you can, there are supplements or certain combinations of foods that you can eat that can replace what we need from meat normally, and of course, like synthetic meats would be a full replacement, at least in theory, and that would, but of course, I am fully comfortable saying that if synthetic meat is fully an option, if it could replace natural meats, for lack of a better term, in their entirety, it would be wrong, and I would have no qualms condemning a society that refused to make that switch. Currently, is my understanding that we are in the early stages of that, and 2 years ago, even more so. As of right now, it's very expensive, which is a different problem. I wouldn't say that this is a moral defense that it's very expensive. It could be made less expensive, and there could be a lot of stuff that goes into that, right? We in the United States, for example, the government subsidizes corn production to a heavy degree. Maybe if it subsidized synthetic meat production, it would be more affordable, but also I don't know if the technology is where it needs to be for all this. Anyway, we'll talk about synthetic meat as though it's a thing in the potentially near future. Not something way off, but also something not present. And that's where I'm happy to leave it, just because I'm not super sure where it is and a lot of the problems that exist there, or what problems exist there. So, that all being said, I guess I've waffled about long enough where you could probably get an idea of what my position is. It is good to be vegan if you can. Maybe for most people at this point, I would consider it supererogatory. Good if you do it, and not really terrible if you don't. You're not, maybe not obligated, but the more able you are to do it, the more I feel that it is something that you should be morally obliged to do. I think I'm comfortable with that position. I think I've talked to, and for what it's worth, I'm really glad that I got to talk out my thought process for this. Oftentimes we encounter people with just fully formed thoughts and they have their reasons, but coming to these conclusions is something that we should think through, should be thorough about, and really confront our own issues with. Sometimes just talking out loud about what you think about a certain position can get you there. This is also something that I think debate can do in a private environment where people are taking it seriously, approaching it honestly, and engaging in good faith with the consideration that you could be wrong. That's something I haven't really touched on very much in these debates. Something I try to do when I debate, and is always in the back of my head when I debate with anyone, is asking myself, like, what if I'm wrong about this? What if what they're saying is correct? Like, what weaknesses exist in my position, not just for a tactical, like, I can cover up for these, but more from, like, oh, okay, maybe there's something to that. Maybe I'm not completely correct about this, and I think that's something that would be really good, at the very least, for viewers to do. Come in with your ideas, that's fine, but be honest about what's being said and be open to hearing what people will say. Maybe by the end of this, I'll be convinced that veganism is fully morally obligatory for anyone who is capable. Not even the more capable you are, the more obligatory it is, but if you are capable of doing so, it would be wrong not to. We'll see. And I don't even know if that's the position Alex will take. So let's just uh, be done with the
Ladies
waffling
and
and go on.
gentlemen, thrilled to have you here for another epic debate. If this is your first
The
time here at
volume
Modern
okay?
Day Debate, want to let you know we are a neutral platform that hosts debates on science, religion, and politics. I'm your host, James Coons, and we want to let you know, no matter what walk of life you come from, no matter where you fall on all of these issues, we hope you feel welcome. And so thanks for being here
Ooh,
with us.
good tea.
It's going to be a fun one today.
Completely digress, but I started watching. The Jasmine Tea reminded me. I started watching this channel it's called Overall Analyzing Avatar. I like Avatar as a show. I think it's really cool, and this is like I love this guy's sense of humor, and it's like the exact right amount of Avatar. Like, maybe I don't have the patience to sit down and rewatch it fully and commit to watching all of it, but this is just enough to give me the taste I want. The reason I mention all of this is uh in one of the videos, the channel creator mentions that Iroh like points out, oh, Iroh says his favorite tea is ginseng tea, but he never mentions it. I wonder if that's like a real tea. Uh, there's no way that's how it's pronounced. Ginseng. Okay, yeah, okay. Okay, this is a real thing. Maybe I should look into that. It's Iroh's favorite tea. That's a that's a hell of an endorsement, right? I'm not gonna get. I generally prefer. I'm gonna put this on the back burner. I'm not gonna go into this too much. I prefer loose leaf tea to tea bags, just because I kind of got into it the, during the coronavirus, and it's kind of fun to put a little time and a little bit of effort into doing this, even though it's not terribly difficult, and somehow feels more authentic. Anyway, digression aside, I was just reminded because of this very good tea.
And I want to let you know a couple of other things. One is that
Okay,
debate actually important, and then we're going to Q. It
get
makes it
past
easier
the
to
intro.
people know the
As
world
much as I
of
love
half
James, we're
once
here for
again.
the debate,
Yes,
and
that would be
it's going to take long enough with how much I talk over these people.
much appreciated. It's a very kind opening. Yes, if you go to my channel, you will find a mixture of advocacy for vegan philosophy from an ethical perspective, as well as some discussion on the philosophy of religion, as well as a podcast that I run speaking to various debaters and speakers in the field. And I trust that the links are in the description of this video.
Absolutely.
They are
They
indeed.
sure are. That includes Alex's YouTube as well as his TikTok.
Right
so
here.
check those out, folks. And welcome back, Smokey Saint. Glad to have you back. Also,
I don't know
linked
who
down
this
in the
Smoky
description, in
person is.
particular his YouTube channel. And so thanks for being here, Smokey.
I'm also
If you'd like to
curious.
share
It's
where
one of
people
those
can-
like with Alex, I would expect a very very well formed arguments, very civil debate, but also like high quality of argumentation. And just because he's here, I have this assumption. You can tell I have a lot of respect for him. Just because he's here, I have this kind of assumption that the Smoky guy will be in a similar vein, but I have no idea. Uh, Oftentimes, modern day debate likes to arrange what will inevitably be a spicy shit show of just like, yeah, like we're talking about flat Earth. Let's get this flat Earth guy in here. That's it. I have no idea. So we'll also be trying to figure out what kind of interlocutor the Smoky Saint person is. I literally I've never heard of them before this moment.
find at your link. Would love to hear it. Thanks so much for being here.
Appreciate it, James. Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Yeah, hi, folks. Absolutely. Unlike my very suave and collected and charismatic counterpart,
He
who
is very suave and
definitely has
collected.
delivery much like a verbal silk, you'll find me to be a bit more like sandpaper, razor blades, and salty lemon juice. So
I already like
that's
this guy.
kind of the type of thing
He's
you'll
funny.
find on my channel, but also a bit more of an open exchange environment. We host lots of open mics. We do after shows for lots of debates that are done here in Modern Day Debate, and we always welcome people to come in and share their perspectives and opinions. And we are a free speech environment, so we want people to come in and share their thoughts unfiltered and organically. So I do run the channel, Smoky Saint. You'll find the link down below, and we are actually doing a debate after show today as well for the two debates happening on Modern Day Debate, the one for abortion and of course this one.
What do y'all think?
And
Should
that'll be
I
later
start
tonight
just
at
doing
6 p.m.
after
Pacific
shows for
Standard Time.
these?
So go down there and set your notification and come join and give your opinions.
Gotcha. Thanks so much.
Oh, something I forgot to mention when I was jawing on at the beginning. This is a debate where we have to remember like what positions people have to take in these from a debate perspective. Alex, as the proponent, saying that veganism is morally obligatory, has the burden of proof. That's something we haven't talked about yet, but should probably go in our concepts discussion. Which is just the idea that he has to demonstrate his point. It's, rejection of the null hypothesis in the similar vein. I know we talked about that prior, but he has the obligation to prove his point. Whereas Smokey could take the mere negation position. He doesn't have to prove. He's not trying to prove that like veganism is bad, and in fact, that would be a little bit of weird if he did. He just has to demonstrate that it's not morally obligatory and merely respond to what Alex has to say. Maybe I can't even imagine what a proactive reason for veganism being not morally obligatory would look like, other than to say it's like actually bad to do, which wouldn't make sense to me. You'd have to do a lot of work to make an argument like that make sense to me, to be honest.
Smokey, and with that, we'll kick
All right,
into
let's
the
get
opening
into it.
statements.
Let's
So
go.
I've got the timer set for roughly 10 minutes, and that's flexible. We can give you an extra minute if you need. And so, Alex, thanks so much. The floor is all yours.
Well, thanks. Maybe I should just stick stopwatch on here to make sure I don't ramble on forever, which is what I have a tendency to do.
I
as I've
feel that.
been
I feel that,
delivering the
Alex.
same kind of talk, the same kind of points over and over again in various virtual talks for universities, because this topic, I'm afraid to say, is a fairly easy one to argue, in my opinion. In fact, I believe that veganism being a moral obligation is one of the most ethically obvious obligations that we hold. And the reason that I think it's so important, and one of the reasons I describe it as the most important moral emergency that we're currently facing, is not due to the specific value in which I put upon the victims, but due to the fact that if you ask people in the street what they think about human trafficking or global poverty or any of these sorts of things, they'll tell you without hesitation that they think that they're terrible and need to be
Okay,
eradicated
I
from
guess I
the
see
earth.
what he's saying. I balked a little bit when he said it was like one of the more important moral issues, and it was like there's a lot of really bad stuff happening. Even 2 years ago, there's a lot of really bad stuff going on. This was you can in the description you can see this was aired 10 days after the Jan 6 attack. There's some stuff going on that's pretty important. There's a genocide in China of the Uyghur Muslims. There's all sorts of stuff. So it seems a little weird that like I guess from a humanist perspective, and maybe in the future this preference for humans over other animals will be a bigotry that people can condemn us for. And honestly, I think that'd be pretty awesome. But at the moment, there is at the very least a general consensus that the interest in human beings should be valued greater than the interest in non-human animals. So it seemed a little weird. But what he was saying was that like a lot of these things are already considered morally wrong and moral issues that need to be addressed, like human trafficking and whatever else. We are clearly know it's wrong when it happens and want to address it. Whereas currently, as we see in a debate like this, we're still trying to make the argument that eating meat is morally wrong. So I guess I think that's what he's trying to say. I was a little surprised. I was like, wait, hold on. That said, a lot of people don't think these things are wrong. Sometimes that's why they do them. Sometimes they know they're wrong, they do them anyway. But like people people run cover for a lot of really terrible things. Like people run cover for the Ukraine invasion, for the Uyghur genocide, for the Holocaust. That's still happening. I think it's less ubiquitous than he would like to think that people are aware these things are wrong. But I guess yes, the average person would agree. Sure.
But if you ask them what they think about factory farming, about animal agriculture, which is responsible not just for untold levels of animal cruelty, but also environmental catastrophe, contribution
This is
to
a
the risk.
surprisingly weak argument from Alex. So kind of the implication here is right, like that it's like these conditions make it bad, but you could alleviate this a bit and say, okay, well, if there were better conditions, would it suddenly not be a problem to eat meat? And I don't think he would agree. And if it's the issue with the conditions, well, then it's the conditions of these factory farms are the problem and not the meat eating. I think he's off to actually kind of a weak start for what I know from him. He could make better arguments, but maybe he's ramping up. He might be building into better positions.
Of
It's sometimes
future
a good
pandemics,
strategy.
as bad or worse than COVID-19 that we're currently dealing with. Our biggest contributor to antibiotic resistance, and one of the biggest things you can do for your health. Not only do they fail to condemn the animal agricultural industry for being the villain on these 5 topics, but they also continue to be the very cause for its existence by continuing to pay for the products of animal agriculture.
This is another
My
instance
point
of
is
like
fairly simple.
I feel a little weird condemning people who eat meat and like support these industries like this in large part because again, some people it's much cheaper than vegan diets and some people can't afford it and I don't really feel comfortable condemning people for surviving in whatever way they can and even if it leads to things like this. The problem is the conditions they're put in. It's a systemic issue, not an individual one.
One of the first things I should mention is to clear up some misconceptions about veganism. No vegan is under the misapprehension that we're not responsible for any kind of animal suffering. Everybody's responsible for some form of animal suffering. Veganism is by definition a minimization to the highest extent practicable of all forms of animal
Okay, it's
suffering.
already
It's
factoring
an
in
extension
what
of
is
what is one of the
possible.
most basic ethical principles shared almost unanimously, certainly across secular morality, and I believe implicitly present in religious morality too, which is that the avoidance of suffering where unnecessary should be attained. That's not to say that suffering never occurs, but where suffering occurs and where we're inflicting it, we need to be justified in doing so. And that's
Something that's really important. I like this a lot from Alex. It's something that often gets skipped over in moral discussions is kind of an assumed shared values. We talked about this a little bit before. One of the most basic ones that even I skipped over because it does seem so natural in my when I was talking about this is, what makes things good or bad is, the amount of suffering and the amount of harm it's causing in the world. I just kind of skipped past that as if it could go without saying, and maybe for most people it can. But in this conversation, it's important to make it clear that this is what we're talking about so that you can draw it back to, well, these animals are suffering. They are being born to exclusively so they can be, well, maybe tortured is the wrong word, but killed at a minimum. And oftentimes these conditions are horrendous, and they are suffering for it. Now, obviously, irrespective of whether people will continue to eat meat, those conditions should and could be done away with. The question, of course, is the eating them for meat part. But obviously, a creature's life is ending. That is a harm being done in the world, and the question is it a necessary harm? At least that's the question in my mind. But that might not be the question in everyone's mind, so we shouldn't expect Alex to exclusively be answering that question. He might be answering other questions that people have in mind, or he might be having to establish all his premises, even the ones that seem very obvious. So I like that he mentioned this because despite it being kind of the background noise of moral conversations, it needs to come up in this context to remind everyone what we're talking about and that there is a harm being done. And what that harm is, right? Why you should have a problem with it, because you likely agree that more suffering is bad.
One of the first points to make is that many people think that veganism is the active thing. It's the affirmative position, and in many ways it is. It's a position that needs to be defended. But be under no illusion that by purchasing animal products, you are implicitly accepting an ideology in your own right. By handing over money, paying for somebody to force animals into gas chamber or to have a bolt put in their head, to be separated from their calves, to be suffocated in bags, to be ground up in industrial macerators, as happens to chicks in the egg industry. By paying that money, you are, economically speaking, demanding for these things to continue, and thereby implicitly accepting an ideology which says that you have a right to do so.
So I didn't expect this to come up here, but I'm a little bit wanting to do the meme here. Sonic, help me out. Why is it not typing? Hello? Boom. Can you guys see this? Oh, not quite. Why can't I make this image where I want it to be? Okay, we're just gonna modify it on OBS. So this is often a cop-out from people like me, people who are socialists, this idea that there is no such thing as ethical consumption under capitalism. But you have to remember why it exists. To some extent, there's a truth behind that, and there's some amount of which you cannot spend your money in a way that will not justify some sort of evil in the world. In this case, we're talking about animal cruelty. In other cases, maybe for buying fast fashion, for example, justifies human slavery and like child labor and stuff in like sweatshops overseas. This, of course, is not a justification and shouldn't be taken as one of, well, just do whatever you want with your money. You can't get around it anyway. Obviously, you should endeavor to minimize the amount of suffering that you contribute to, but you can't really get away from this. And I especially don't like the thorough and pretty harsh condemnation Alex is presenting to anyone who buys meat without yet considering that some people don't have much of a choice. Um, and to be so like so I don't know. It just feels a little. It's got my hack my what's it my hackles my cackles when the cat does it's got my that going. It might just be a little bit of like, oh, you feel attacked. There's an element of psychology that goes into that. It doesn't make me right that that's the reaction I have, to be clear. Just saying like how I feel about this kind of position, and it feels a little weird to me that we haven't yet talked about it. I don't know, maybe because it's so important to me, I feel it should have come up, but maybe that's not as appropriate. The point is, you know, you could theoretically say like, oh, you're contributing to animal cruelty by doing this, but maybe you contribute to additional harms by buying from some other company because they like the vegan food company is like they're not harming animals, but they have sweatshops or something. Now I'm not saying that's the case, and my guess is most foods don't come like most vegan foods still come from the same kind of manufacturers. They have other things that they're doing. Maybe I guess you could make the argument that buying the meat has the same impact. It's just also with extra animal cruelty like flavoring on top. And maybe that would be the way you can reduce it. But it feels a little weird to be like, well, you're causing harm because you're spending this money. Well, it's not like you have a lot of choices with where you spend your money and how you buy things and the things that these people do. It's kind of a systemic problem in that way. And again, it's like an individual condemnation for a systemic problem.
I must have missed the memo on the idea of people having the right to pay for this kind of animal cruelty to be inflicted.
And of course, people aren't paying for the animal cruelty being inflicted. They're paying for the meat. If that meat was done without the animal cruelty that he's describing in these factory farms, they would have done the same thing. They would have simply purchased the meat and eaten it. The big difference is the slaughtering is the distinction, which he hasn't really made a case for yet. Yeah, this is like surprisingly bad argumentation from Alex. I'm a little disappointed so far, even though we're only a couple minutes in. It's a lot of visceral. Oh, isn't it terrible how these animals are tortured, and not really like good arguments. Maybe that's the angle he wants to go for. I feel bad having talked him up this much when these are the arguments he's coming up with because they're pretty weak, honestly. Like I said, the people could. If the factory farming conditions weren't this bad and people spent the money on the same thing, he would probably still take issue with it because these animals are being killed. But you should be able to see immediately that these people aren't paying for animal cruelty. What they're paying for is the product, and they don't really have much control over how that product is delivered to them. The problem again is systemic, and he's just he's just taking issue with people buying meat because I don't know, because as he says it, they're paying for animal cruelty, which is not what they're doing.
Okay. This is one of the things that I would need to be convinced of to understand why people don't see it as morally obligatory to abstain from purchasing these products. Of course, veganism is slightly more complicated and nuanced in the fact that there are many different ways of procuring animal products. There are so-called better farms and worse farms. Yep. But the fact of the matter is that whilst everybody likes to say that I try to make sure my meat comes from an ethical source, I try to make sure I eat organic, free-range eggs, firstly having no idea what those terms even mean and what the legal restrictions on them are, it remains true that around 99% of the animal products consumed, at least in the United States, come from factory farms. Right, and so if you are somebody who buys food,
it seems like his issue with this is factory farms,
or from any restaurant that you find on the high street, then you're paying for this factory farming, this nightmarish industry of factory farming, and you'll need to justify yourself in doing so. And unless you can identify exactly where you could find meat or other animal products which are procured in the strangely specific ethical conditions in which people like to present to say that there are some ethical ways to consume animal products, unless you can identify exactly where they are and guarantee that every single time you ever consume an animal product that's where it comes from, then you de facto have to go vegan and abstain from purchasing animal products until you know they come from an ethical source. And then there's
this is really wild. I was gonna let him finish the position, but he's continuing even past this. This is fucking wild to me. Alex, you're better than this. He's exclusively taking issue with factory farming, even to the exclusion of caring about ethical meat consumption if the meat can be acquired otherwise. He's saying like, okay, it's like this mythical thing that doesn't really exist, and it's like, okay, but if it did, you'd be okay with it? It sounds like he would be, which is kind of wild. Isn't there still a harm there? Why are we talking like I don't know who the Smoky Saint guy is. Maybe he won't have an issue with factory farmers, but like most people I think would. And you go, okay, fine. Then the problem is factory farms and not meat eating or meat products. One of the things that I was even thinking of as he was going on this diatribe was my girlfriend's parents have a chicken coop in their backyard. They have like I think they have like 10 chickens now because they hatched a new a new, I don't know, litter. I don't know what you call it, a new clutch of eggs, um, and they're just pets to them. They don't kill them for their meat. Instead, they're pets. You take care of them. You protect them. You have like a bit of an affection with them, and in exchange, like they're eggs that aren't fertilized. Those are eggs. You have them in the morning or whatever. And I wonder if he would take issue with this because these chickens are being treated well whenever possible. They try to like give them little treats or whatever. Last time I went for Thanksgiving, we made pumpkin pie for their family out of an actual pumpkin. So they're like, oh, why don't like how about the stuff that like we can't really eat but the chickens could? We can give them to them as a treat. Like they try to treat them well. And maybe you could take issue of like, oh, they're in captivity. Well, maybe they would have died in the fucking wild. There's some amount of like of give and take with this. Like there's a bit of like exchange of protection for a little bit of freedom. You can get into these arguments. It gets really deep philosophically in that way. But all of the things he's talked about has just been a complaint about factory farms. Okay, a case like that, right? Is there a problem with eating the eggs? Because while yes, that's not meat, and so far he's only talked about meat. Veganism isn't exclusively meat eating. It's also animal products, cheese, milk, eggs, things like this, fur, leather. I wonder, does he have issues with wool? If you just have a sheep as a pet and you shear it for wool every now and again, you're not even hurting the animal. Some sheep at this point couldn't survive if they didn't have their wool sheared. It would get in their face and their eyes. It'd be hard for them to move around or to see. All of his arguments have been completely void of the philosophical ideas and only complaining about factory farming, which is a problem, but that's not what we're arguing about. I'm like, I really can't get over how disappointed I am at what his arguments are so far, because I've seen him make very good arguments. I think I've even seen a video of him giving strong arguments for veganism, and they're just not here. It's really weird to me.
There's a discussion to be had about whether those so-called ethical sources are even ethical.
Okay, so we can have a discussion whether those ethical sources are even ethical. Then let's have it, because that's a necessary component to what you're talking about. Now, it feels a little implied here that the thing that he would take issue with as far as their being ethical is that they do not enough distinguish themselves from factory farm. They're not really ethical. They still do the same things, and not the problem of, well, there is an ethical problem to the act of farming animals in the first place, which is where I would assume that this debate would have to begin with. We even saw in the beginning, I'm like a little upset here because from the beginning, I assumed a more philosophical discussion was coming, especially from Alex, who's usually much better about this. And I know for my viewers who aren't familiar with him, it seems a little weird for me to have, but like I've seen him before. This is really weird, and we're just not getting into the philosophical justification or the philosophical arguments against any sort of animal farming. It's a little weird. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, honestly, like now that I think about it, because that example of the pet chickens thing is something that I hadn't really much thought of when I was doing my opening discussion of what my thoughts on the matter are, and it makes me wonder, like, maybe even veganism isn't like, I don't even know that I could have a moral issue with having a cow or a chicken as a pet, and maybe you milk them or you gather their eggs that aren't fertilized or whatever. You're not really harming them. Some of the harms in factory farms come from the fact these cows are kept continuously pregnant so that they can continuously produce milk, so they can be continually milked, and that's awful. It's absolutely horrendous that happens. I have no qualms about saying that. That should be obvious to everybody. But if you just have a pet cow, like, okay, there's that freedom versus protection thing, and then you start to argue of like, is having any kind of pet justifiable, and you get into this really deep philosophical discussion that at the very least I'm not currently willing to have, and I definitely don't have strong reasons to believe that having a pet would be unethical. But it seems like we're not going to get these arguments, and this is not who I expected more from Alex. This is really weird.
Endemic
I don't like
to animal agriculture is the exploitation of animals.
Okay, good. Let's get into that.
The kind of case against animal suffering is to do with not wanting to kill animals, but it's not as simple as that. It's about wanting to reduce the amount of suffering that they go through, and that's why vegetarianism isn't enough.
Okay, I'll let him talk, but like, clearly, so he's like, okay, it's not enough to just not kill them, right? Vegetarianism isn't sufficient. So he has to have a problem with eggs and milk and other animal products, wool, and to justify that would be a little difficult off of the back of the kind of argument he was just trying to make. Now maybe he might make a different kind of argument going forward, but this seems to be leading out of the previous.
In the milk industry, cows produce milk for the same reason we do. They're mammals. They need to be pregnant and have children in order to produce milk. So they're forcibly impregnated.
Yes. Okay. This is the fact. Now back to the factory farming thing.
Because that calf is going to want the milk. The milk is being produced for the calf after all. The calf is separated from the mother, taken away, which causes the same kind of psychological distress that it would do if you did it to a human being. And that,
I'm actually really glad. I know I can't stop interrupting. You should be used to this by now. But this is the kind of debate that made me want to make this channel. Wanting so badly to be where Smokey is sitting, to take issue with these kinds of arguments, you could be making good arguments, man. And I don't even necessarily disagree with you, but like these arguments are just so bad, and we'll see if Smokey capitalizes on. I don't know. Again, I don't know. Maybe he'll say literally everything that I've already mentioned. I have no idea, but this is what made me want to make a debate channel in the first place, because these kinds of arguments are just so bad, even from someone who should know better and should be better able to make compelling arguments that are philosophically grounded. I will be honest, and I've said it already, part of why I'm so riled right now is I know he's better than this, and it's really upsetting to see someone who could be doing much, much better making such bad arguments.
Mother cow will continually go through that cycle of forcible impregnation, separation from their calves, and those calves might be bolt gunned in the head.
Factory farming is a problem. It is not necessary for animal product consumption.
That cycle will continue until the mother can no longer produce any milk, at which point she's sold to a slaughterhouse, and that's the thanks that we give her for providing us with these products. And I remind you that the reason this is happening is because you go into Starbucks and you order a latte. Right?
Not true. Not true at all. The reason that it's happening is because capitalism incentivizes people to maximize profits. You do this by reducing costs, so things like quality conditions or having enough cows that would naturally become pregnant that you could milk them all and produce enough. Instead, just keep impregnating the same one, and then maximizing revenue by, okay, you've milked this cow to death, now sell it to a slaughterhouse. This is not because there is an interest in milk. You can demonstrate it should be really obvious if you look back to 2,000 years ago, for example. Factory farming wasn't a thing. People still had access to cows and chickens and animal products. They weren't being tortured and slaughtered in this way. The problem that Alex is laying out is exclusively a problem of the modern era and the methods that are currently used in farming that you could take issue with without necessarily being a vegan. Veganism, I think there are good arguments for veganism being an additionally moral action, as we said, a supererogatory moral action. In the framework, in the paradigm that Alex has laid out here, but you just say, okay, factory farming is a problem. That's something that should be addressed, even if you want to be a meat eater. But he's not making arguments for veganism. He's making arguments against factory farming, which is bad. Good, we're in agreement. But make your actual case, please.
Of animals on such an unimaginable scale, and the scale is unimaginable.
Yeah, it is really awful.
Essay not long ago, when there was a lot of noise around a contestant on a TV show called Love Island who it transpired that he was a trophy hunter, and there were very public calls for him to be kicked off the program because people couldn't believe that he was going on these safaris and shooting wild animals and taking pictures.
This would be a better example and anecdote if you had made an argument that the death of these animals is a harm unto itself, which it is. You could really easily make that argument, but that's not what you did. Instead, you were like, well, it's the factory farming that's a problem. It comes off a little bit like people should be mad about the farming and not mad about the trophy hunter. And I don't think he would agree with that.
Discussed it. For a point of reference, 70,000 animals per year are killed by trophy hunters. Generally considered to be a bad thing. Fairly disgusting. I'd be interested to hear what...
Honestly, I think it'd be kind of cool to have a wave of, instead of like trophy hunters, like I don't know, like trophy animal friend makers. Like, wouldn't it be kind of neat if there's like a cultural thing of like, okay, you go out into the safari, you find like a lion or something, and what you're trying to do is like, I don't know, pet it. Like, maybe that's really dangerous and you shouldn't do it, but it like be kind of neat of like, all right, I got a picture with this animal, goodbye. Like, you just leave it like it's good, no harm done. But it'd be kind of neat. I don't know. It feel like it'd be kind of it's like a Pokemon Snap esque type escapade. Words, I can do them. I did debate for years. I can speak. Oh, hey, Khalid. I don't know if you just popped in. I already got very angry at at the Cosmic Skeptic, despite I think for the like being closer to his side of the argument, at least from the outset, than the opposition. Uh, you should go back. Yeah, hi, welcome. You've missed a lot of righteous indignation.
Mr. Saint Smokey, if I may, has to say on an issue like that, or things like dog hunting, or whatever it may, or dog fighting, these kinds of things. I wonder if our ability to exploit pigs, cows, and sheep would also extend to all of the animal kingdom, and perhaps even some humans, depending on the characteristics that they have in common. 70,000 animals killed by trophy hunters per year. The same number of chickens are killed for food every 32 seconds. 32 seconds.
Wild.
It's difficult to conceptualize. It's impossible to conceptualize the level, the number.
I didn't know that.
Of animals
That's
that we're talking about
insanity.
here. We're talking about tens of billions. 100 billion people, or thereabouts, have ever lived on planet Earth. There have only been about 100 billion human beings ever alive on planet Earth, ever. And we're approaching that number of non-human animals being slaughtered every single year to satiate an addiction to the taste of their flesh and secretions.
So this is the kind of argument I think he should have been making up until this point, as opposed to what he had been saying. And then we can get into the conversations that I had laid out in the beginning, things like ought implies can and so on and so forth. But instead, this is more it feels more in the context of you just have a problem with factory farming, which, fair, same. This is a distinct position. It just in the flow of the rhetoric feels like it's part of the same one. I think he also hasn't done a great job of distinguishing between the different points of his argument, but we'll let it go. I mostly agree with this. Yeah, it's a harm being done to the world. Maybe it doesn't need to be done. But then, of course, you have other things that you have to confront. And the method by which he's approaching these arguments, I don't think he's going to confront the problems that I've already laid out. Things like, okay, what if you just have a chicken as a pet and you eat its eggs or whatever? It doesn't seem like he's going to get to stuff like that. He seems to have written off that as a concept and seems to have assumed that factory farming is literally the only way that people can have animal products, as opposed to it is currently the only way that people do have access to it. Those are different things. This is actually a reasonable concept to bring up here. Is the is-ought distinction. Just because something is doesn't mean that's how it should be. And in a weird way, he's doing it, where he's saying like, well, it's the way that it is, so there's no other way it could be. And I was like, well, maybe it could be different. Maybe if we solved the factory farming problem, are you okay? Probably not. But that's not what the arguments you're making are.
And that doesn't include sea life. If you include sea life, the number goes in to the trillions. Lots of people like to fall back on the idea that by buying so-called free-range organic animal products, they're doing their bit. But
I mean, you'd have to acknowledge it's better than not,
if you
right?
think that this is the case, that free-range chickens can still be housed in barns at a density of 9 chickens per square meter. Not only this, but in the egg industry, because they're genetically engineered differently to the chickens used for meat, the males are completely useless because the males aren't going to lay eggs. So the males are culled at birth, and this is industry standard practice across all industrialized egg production, including free-range and organic
and that's
farms.
really terrible. There's a problem with
Which means that
industrialized
as soon as these chicks are born, if they're
animal
male,
product production.
then they're immediately killed, and this is done either by throwing them onto a conveyor belt and into an industrial mass.
I'd like to take a pause here, because whenever I see an argument like this, I don't want to let it play out without reminding people watching what's going on. It's very easy to get sucked into this because he's describing things that are really terrible, and it's very easy to be like, oh, that is really awful. Don't you want it? And this is a very emotional argument. This is what we call a pathos argument. I just want to remind you that this does not actually prove the argument that he's trying to use it to prove. It doesn't prove that veganism is morally obligatory. It proves only that factory farming or the methods of farming that are currently done in an industrial scale are a problem. It doesn't have anything to say about the philosophical grounding of his position. And so I do want to interrupt it just to kind of give you a breather so that you can, because it's hard. It's hard to listen to all this suffering and just move on and say that's not really relevant. It feels kind of cold. It is relevant, just not to what we're talking about. If you want to have a discussion about factory farming, I'm right there with you. And anyone who would oppose anyone who would oppose a condemnation of factory farming, I think would be a moral monster, and it would be very easy. I think you should have no qualms about condemning someone who would go to bat for that. But that's not what we're talking about either. And so let's like take a breather. Let's calm down just a little bit. I was gonna say drink some of my jasmine tea, but I've already finished my tea. So maybe drink some water. Just cool it down a bit, and then get back into this. In fact, I remember when I was doing competitive debate, there was a group of people I'd heard about that were taking this exact thing that I'm doing, this ability to, or that both of us are doing, or I say both of us, both Alex and I are doing, where we're talking about very just really awful things going on, like the conditions, and either just spouting it off like it's a fact, which he isn't really doing. He clearly cares about this, or doing what I'm doing, where I'm saying, okay, but it's not really relevant, and pointing out debate is a little bit is just kind of about the performance and not about what we're talking about. And then they would extrapolate from that. Well, if it's just a performance, then I can do this, and then like tell ghost stories or whatever. I think that's a really misguided argument for a lot of reasons. But I can understand why someone might look at what I'm doing and say that's what's happening, because I'm saying, okay, yeah, that's bad, but who cares? It's not exactly what I'm saying. I'm just saying it's not relevant to what we're talking about right now. And just because something is bad doesn't mean it has relevance to the discussion. Like, I can counter with this with saying, like, there's a genocide. There are, like, how many genocides happening right now? Isn't that important? Well, not to what we're talking about.
To be ground up alive, suffocated in a plastic bag under the weight of other chicks or under the bag.
Yeah, and this is really bad.
Or in the words
no
of
one
the
should be in
British
favor of
Egg
this.
Information Service, humanely gassed, if there isn't such a contradiction in terms present anywhere else in our ethical thinking. The challenge is this. It's a matter of consistency. It may be asked what my meta-ethical position is, how I justify.
It's also not lost on me that Alex,
and these are interesting
in his accent and cadence, is pretty reminiscent of Christopher Hitchens. And I guess when he's spouting off all of these very emotional descriptions of what's going on, he's similar in that way of appealing not to argument but to I guess revulsion of a concept. Hitchens would do this with authoritarianism a lot. I think Alex is, I don't know about much smarter, but I think he's more philosophically rigorous most of the time. But it's not lost on me, the comparison.
And I'm happy to address them.
Oh, is it hard to hear? Yeah, he's pretty quiet, right?
Because the argument that I make is one from consistency, which is this. If you think it is wrong to harm human beings in this way, or particularly other animals in this way, such as a dog, if you're the kind of person who, if you were walking down the street, saw somebody beating up a dog for no other reason than the thrill they got from it, if you're the kind of person who would stop them from doing so, and yet simultaneously the kind of person who pays for pigs to be forced into gas chambers, I believe that you're harboring a moral inconsistency that needs to be immediately addressed.
Again, he's talking about it as if the distinction that people who eat animal products or consume animal products in any way are pro the torture. Well, they're not. They're pro the product, and if that product was delivered to them without the torture, they would probably be happier about it. It's really weird. This is how many times has he done this now? It's really off topic, or I shouldn't say off topic. It's really missing the mark on what this argument should look like and what it's actually saying.
Challenge that I would have for my opponent this evening, which is this: I will assume, for the sake of argument, although this may not be true, I don't know, that you believe that if we were to take a human being and force that human being into a gas chamber, that would be an unethical thing to do. I want to then take the situation the majority of pigs in my country, at least, pigs killed for slaughter, are killed similarly by forcing them into a gas chamber. Now, I wouldn't wish to draw an equivalency between human beings and other animals. There are many, many important differences between humans and other animals, but I want to identify these specific differences that justify the difference in treatment. That is to say, if I took that pig.
So now he's kind of forcing a position on his opponent that it's implied that his opponent should disagree, should take the opposite position, and if he doesn't, then Alex is right. But it's incorrect entirely. You know, I can say that they're morally both abhorrent. Neither of them should ever happen. So our farming should stop doing the gassing. Cool. We're in agreement, right? But we haven't actually arrived at veganism by doing so. We've simply ended a horrific practice that shouldn't be happening. It's not the same thing. It's just not making the right argument. What about people who pay more for products from untortured animals? So this is actually what he was just talking about a little bit, is that these like free range or whatever other terms, or like ethically sourced animal products are often misnamed as such. He mentioned something like 9 chickens per square meter in these free range chickens or whatever else, and that it's more of like a legal classification than an adherence to the concept. But I do wonder what he would say about, like, okay, if that can be acquired, and he wondered if it was even possible earlier before you popped in. He wondered if it was even possible for that to be a thing. It was a little weird.
And if you don't like the gas,
I guess weird is the word I'm just
you
going to
can use whatever kind of farming method you think is fine. If you think it's okay to give this pig a nice life and then bolt gun it in the head, I would imagine you'd think it would be wrong to do the same thing to a human being. And here's what you have to identify: in what ways and to what extent is that pig different from a human being that justifies the difference in treatment?
So this works. I would agree, right? Now you're even saying, like, okay, what amount of farming is acceptable to you? And like, even if you let it live its life and killed it, isn't that a problem? I would tend to agree. I don't know if animals that just like die on their own are safe to eat. If they are, like, would he have a problem with that? Maybe he wouldn't do that with a human, but there are different reasons for that than moral ones, mostly because it's icky. Additionally, what if then you're encountered again with the problem, well, that's merely vegetarianism. What if I'm comfortable with letting it live its life, but it's unfertilized eggs I eat, or I drink the milk that it doesn't that is in excess of what its calves drink, or I shear it for its wool because it would suffer if I didn't. That's the big one. Is wool. I don't know if that falls into the category of veganism. I don't know if vegans have issues with wool. I wonder if it'll come up here, but this is something that kind of unaddressed. He hasn't bridged the gap fully. He has said, first, factory farming is a thing that should be done away with, which is not what we're talking about, and something to which everyone should be in agreement with, unless like otherwise it's very clear there are moral monsters. And then he has led up to 2. Meat eating should be considered more, or not eating meat should be considered morally obligatory. Which, okay, I think he's made that position pretty clear, but that's vegetarianism, which he has already rejected as insufficient. What are you saying? You can buy from small family farms that is really ethical. Yeah, I mean, I even mentioned my girlfriend's parents have some chickens. Like, they're just pets. They don't kill them for food. They just, well, you have these eggs that are going to waste otherwise, so we'll take them or whatever. Yeah, it's like he's against all farming, but hasn't justified it. I think you could. I think you could. I mean, that's part of veganism, right? Is the trying to minimize as much as possible the consumption of animal products. He laid that out pretty early on, so I'm if you weren't here, that's fine. But he hasn't really encountered some of these issues. He hasn't really addressed some of these issues, and he's only now barely gotten to eating meat is wrong, as opposed to the implied that it's wrong because it's currently sourced from unethical sources. well, if they were ethical sources, would it be okay? Well, now we have the first instance of, even if it was the most ethical source you can imagine, meat eating is wrong, but he hasn't gotten to there for animal products. We'll see. We'll see if he gets there.
Treatment. In other words, how like a pig, and in what ways does that human being have to be to justify the treatment of that pig upon the human? If we took a human being in a gas chamber and we gave him 4 legs instead of 2, would it be okay to keep him in that gas chamber? Probably not.
Okay.
What if we change the human being's skin color? Now he's got pink skin. Still not okay to put him in the gas chamber. What if we lower the human being's intelligence? Right? What if we justify killing this human being on the basis of him being?
I think he's over making this point. I don't think he's contributing very much. But it's also tough because you have to, like, with arguments like this, you kind of have to meet the person where they are. And I don't know how familiar he is with Smokey Saint. I am completely unfamiliar, so I would be unsure as to where he is on this discussion. And I think in part of why we were reaching this problem is because Alex has been too insistent on specificity. I think on a philosophical level, you can make very good arguments for this that have nothing to do with factory farms and how awful that treatment is. You could back up then and say okay, do you at least have a problem with the factory farming things? Like, and then maybe you can make a pragmatic argument that without factory farms, it seems unlikely that we would be able to produce enough meat for the amount of consumption. And okay, sure, but that's not what he's doing, right? And it's just like insistence on specificity and arguing things that are not on topic.
See how the Nazis justified killing the mentally disabled in the Holocaust. But now we can keep going, and what we essentially have is a 4-legged creature with pink skin, of the intelligence of a pig, experiencing the world as a pig. Give it a curly tail if you like to, and you still haven't found the difference. At which point you'll say, now it's okay to kill this thing. Now it's okay to put this being in a gas chamber because we have this vague notion of it.
Is this weird thing of like going back to the gas chamber? Some people might take like this is again where the specificity is hurting him. Kosher and halal practices include methods for how to kill an animal with the intention of minimizing its suffering as it dies. That's built into the idea because because the people who made these rules understood that that causing undue suffering would be bad, especially at that time when it wasn't really feasible for them to live without consuming meat and animal products. Minimizing that harm was clearly something that they ought to do, even if they're going to eat the animal. But now, in the insistence of the gas chamber and like in this needless cruelty as part of it, it makes it seem like, well, if you can't have the animal products without the cruelty, when you can, and when anyone who realizes this, well, then these arguments are going to be falling on their deaf ears. It's just not going to work, and that's where I am. It's just not working because I have that understanding. Now, I would agree that as much as it's possible, you shouldn't be killing animals for food. You're still causing harm to a living creature that is unnecessary. But that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about the necessity. We're not talking about the harm. We're instead talking about the awful conditions. And it's bad because it's a gas chamber is the implication. But would it be not bad if it was quick and painless? He would probably say that it was still bad, but he keeps honing in on this because it's viscerally upsetting, because it should bother you. With that image should upset you, which, indeed it does, but it's not an argument. It's not a good argument. But don't they slit their throat and turn them upside down, the slow and torturers? Yeah, so I didn't say they succeeded in their endeavors to make the killing quick and painless. That was simply the intent, right? And with that in mind, there are ways where you could, in fact, kill an animal quickly and painlessly. I am aware that the methods that kosher and halal laws use do not actually succeed in their intent, but there are ways where it could. If I'm not understanding one method of doing so, I learned this from No Country for Old Men, which I'm guessing a lot of people, there's like a compressed air powered like piston that they'll sometimes use. You like put it to their forehead and it puts the piston into the animal's brain within a split second, and they're just dead like that. That's my understanding, at least for the intent. I don't know how accurate that is to the actual experience and how much it lives up to the. But if you could theoretically just be like, oh, it's dead now, having caused no harm, it just like blink and you'll miss it. It never opened its eyes from that blink. Would that be okay? I would argue probably no, unless it's absolutely necessary. And I think Alex would agree, but he's packing in so many other variables where it would be very easy for someone to say, well, yeah, if I just got rid of the gross torturous elements, then it'd be fine and I can keep eating meat and your arguments don't make any sense. And they would be right to reject those arguments, but not right in the position they arrived at, I think.
Being human. But we have a being that walks like a pig, talks like a pig, thinks like a pig. And we've never, when making these changes, metamorphizing this human into the pig, we haven't come across the point at which we say it's now okay to kill this being. But we now have...
Actually, a really good case, I know he hasn't said anything else of substance for me to respond to, but a really good case that I would be interested in discussing the moral ramifications of, and I don't have a good answer to this, is the Donner Party. In case anyone is unfamiliar, just during, I believe, the 1800s, the travel across the breadth of the United States was a lot more treacherous. The technology wasn't really there. You're traveling in like covered wagons or whatever. And there was one group, the Donner Party, that got stranded in, I believe, the Sierra Nevada mountain range during the winter, frozen in. They couldn't really travel, and they, at some point, ran out of food. And at some point, as the story goes, started eating each other. And one question I would ask Alex is, does he think that was immoral? That they were morally obliged not to do that? That despite the fact that it was their only way of surviving, that they were morally obligated to die as opposed to kill and eat their compatriots in order to survive. I think that's a really difficult problem. I think that's one that you could get into a lot of philosophical discussion about and not really reach a conclusion. I would think I land closer on, well, what other choice did you have? If you were if everyone was gonna die anyway, at least there's actually less harm by only some of the people dying. And I think it's really awful that these situations occur. Obviously, it's not identical to the situation with animals, but if that's your only choice, let's say you're in a situation where that's the only access to food that you really have, maybe he would agree that like in a modern society, maybe you should, if you can't afford the food, maybe you should shoplift it, and it would be wrong for society to punish you. I don't know if that's the position he'd take. I know a lot of more socialist-minded people would agree with a position like that. Like maybe food shouldn't be paywalled because we literally need it to survive. But let's say you're in a situation where even it's not just a monetary access thing. Literally you could not survive. Like you can't get the correct nutrients without eating animal product. Would he think that it's wrong? I don't know. And I don't know because the arguments he's making are so far removed from the philosophy and the ethics of the situation, and are instead caught up in the specificity of what currently exists as opposed to the concepts in general. And I think that's huge weaknesses in his argument for that reason, when he could be making a much stronger case that I would likely agree with. And it's just kind of weird, like, to see someone making making such what should be much better, much easier arguments so poorly, who's definitely capable of much better.
What is essentially a pig. So we have a pig in this gas chamber now, which we still don't think it's right to gas to death or kill in other means. And yet we have a pig in a gas chamber over here, and that's how you produce your breakfast in the morning. Unless you can identify what the morally relevant difference is, then you have two options. You can either say that actually it is okay to force a human being into a gas chamber if, say, they have lower intelligence, if, say, they have 4 legs. You can go that way, but I don't think that's a way that anybody wants to take. I've certainly never seen someone do it in my history of...
It actually raises the question, he's just jawing on, so I don't mind talking over him. I am curious if there's ever a situation where it's morally obligatory to die. I don't think I can think of one. I wonder if there was one you could come up with.
I'm running up about 12 minutes, so I'll pass it on to Smoking.
Oh, he's done anyway.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that, Cosmic. And want to remind you folks, both of our guests are linked in the description.
So I think Smokey's position should be really easy to make here. I don't know how adept he is at any of this. I've never heard of this guy before, so we'll see. I think Alex left him with a pretty easy position to take, and we'll see where he goes with it. It's very possible he's just the kind of like, nah, I'd be wrong to not eat animals because, like, fuck them, we have dominion. I have no idea. Like, some people, like, especially more biblically minded people will say, like, God gave humans the command over the animal and like dominion over animals, so what we do with them is our right, and like they don't have any say in the matter. I would disagree with that vehemently, and like maybe that's the kind of position he'll take. I will see, but if he takes mere negation and just addressing what Alex has said, this should be trivial for him. I've seen animal shows where an elderly chimp goes off to the side to die so she doesn't slow down her tribe. Well, okay, that's like the method of the method. You're dying anyway, right? So it's not, the choice wasn't between dying and not dying. The choice was between dying in a way that causes more harm or dying in a way that causes less harm, right? I just mean in the sense, could you ever be in a position where morally your survival would be wrong, right? Like if in a case like the Donner Party is the one that comes to mind, could you make the argument that it would be morally correct to simply die, to simply starve to death because eating each other would have been more wrong? So something like that. It would be more wrong to keep yourself alive than to continue living. I wonder if there could even be a situation like that. Elderly, not necessarily. Oh, okay, maybe. Maybe that's a kindness. I don't know if I'd say like they're morally obligated to do that. Okay, maybe that's worth considering at the very least. All right, Smokey, what you got?
So thanks so much, Smokey. The floor is all yours.
Does he need the floor? He's Smoke, right? Like he can just float there. He doesn't need to have the floor. I'm being an idiot. It's fine. Get used to that. I'm a doofus. Let's go.
Oh, Smokey, you're on mute.
Sorry.
Classic.
Okay.
Yeah, no
I actually did create a little. Thank you so much for that opening, Alex. That was beautifully delivered. Thank you. I actually did prepare a little opening, James. So if I can maybe share the screen.
It's off to a bad start. You probably, for a position like for a position like this, there are only a few arguments that I think you could guarantee you're going to make, just irrespective of what Alex would say. So it's weird that he has a bit of a slideshow. This actually leads me. Okay, we're gonna put Smokey off a little bit more because it reminds me of a concept that that I have on this list but I haven't yet gotten to, and that's the debate idea of blocking. Basically, in most arguments, there's only going to be so many things a person could say about it, and you can prepare in advance for what those arguments could be. This is why when I was discussing the matter at the beginning, I was taking positions like ought implies can as like the first thing I wanted to talk about, because obviously when it comes to veganism, there's going to be like, if you're going to say it's morally necessary, this is something that's going to come up of like, well, I can't be obliged to do something that I can't do. And you could have Alex could have counter arguments to something like this. Blocking is that idea of I'm just gonna put a million to dos, and maybe we'll do a fill in the to do stream at some point, because I don't want to slow us down more than I'm already slowing us down. But as I was saying, blocking is sometimes overused. In this case, there are some arguments that you can already make, but I keep adding to it. And I'm glad I have it, to be honest. There are some arguments you could already make that you could make irrespective of what Alex says, but you could overdo it also. You could end up arguing against things Alex had never said. And so blocking is often something suggested to people as, have these arguments ready, but don't necessarily trot them out unless you hear them. It's just when you hear them say, what's a good example? Maybe maybe the argument about creationism. Like when you say, well, the Bible says so, here's the list of counter arguments you have, because you could think of those things on the fly, but it just alleviates a little bit of that mental burden to already have them done. This can be overdone. Sometimes people will plug in arguments that don't really apply, or plug in arguments that aren't really that like feel a little too like they don't line up exactly with how the person is using the position that you're responding to. You have to, or it just feels too rigid. So you have to be careful with something like this. But it's a good idea to just have ideas of things that you're people often call this prep for debate, an online debate, because they don't realize what they're doing. Like I've seen debates where people are like, "Oh, did Assad do this gas bombing or whatever?" It's like, well, these are the things people usually say about it, so I have my counter arguments to these things, for example. And that's we're seeing a little bit of that here, but I'm worried that he'll have too much of it. Again, I'm talking way too much about what I haven't yet heard. We'll just let him get into it. Let's see it. Hit us with your slideshow. Yeah, the list definitely has grown. I think I responded to that already. But yeah, it's also, in case anyone wants access to this list, I'm pretty sure I already put a link to it on my channel page.
There we go. And can you guys see it okay? Okay, beautiful. Awesome. All right, and I guess I will begin. Greetings and thanks to everyone for being here. I extend my sincerest of gratitude to James and Alex for making this debate happen. It is a great honor to be the opponent for Alex's auspicious return to modern-day debate after about a year of absence. Clearly, the audience is excited, and I share in that excitement. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alex, for accepting me as your debate opponent today. I very much look forward to a fruitful exchange of ideas. The first point, I'd like to summarize the ethical justification of veganism as I see it.
He probably shouldn't be doing this. This is one of the problems with prepared arguments on a negation position. Your opponent should have said this. He should have already summarized the ethical justification. If you've written it in advance, it's possible you're going to misconstrue it. Even if you don't, you should be responding to what he has said about it. You should instead be like, my opponent has summarized it in this way, as opposed to basically saying this is what your argument actually is. This is a little... Oh, thanks for watching as long as you did. Have a good one. I'll catch you next time. All right. Rest of chat, let's keep going.
Of the veganism moral framework, which is commonly claimed to be epistemologically substantiated, but I believe it does actually have problems.
And I think in this case he's going to be making Alex's argument for him.
By nature of the moral agency possessed by humans, there is a moral obligation to minimize suffering while maximizing well-being of all
sentient Alex creatures. More or less said this.
This is a common humanistic approach in an attempt to synthesize an objective moral framework, but I feel it falls short as it relies heavily on subjective arbitrary decisions of whoever is
so Smokey Satan is making the philosophical argument.
Minimal suffering and what constitutes maximum well-being. These two things must be subjectively discerned and can often be in stark opposition to each other. So using this as an objective standard is a bit deceptive to me. As a quick example of how this framework can fail in its
a weird problem. This is the problem I was talking about. He's making the philosophical argument, and he's doing it well, and he's like trying to address the philosophical problems with this. But that wasn't the nature of Alex's opening, and it feels a little weird to be coming off like the philosophical underpinnings when your opponent wasn't even presenting the philosophical positions. You should be arguing with what he presented. Maybe then following with, even if you wanted to make a philosophical position, like an ethical justification for your position, which you didn't do, by the way. Here's why it would have issues, but especially as the negative, you should have your arguments respond to how I keep tripping over myself. Apologies. The nature of your arguments should be kind of informed by the nature of the arguments your opponent is making. There's just not, like, don't make his point for him and then tear it apart. Like, talk about what he's actually talked about. And then in the discussion portion, when you eventually arrive at the issues he has with the concept as opposed to the specificity that he had laid out, then you can get into this, because now you're just, I don't know, it feels like leaving too much of what he said on the table while simultaneously making too good an argument. I don't know, it just doesn't seem right for this situation.
Or were seen as disposable so that central working communist machine could continue to keep working. What is sometimes claimed as the maximum benefit isn't realistically or consequentially the case at all. This moral framework can very easily be implemented as might makes right, which is usually also...
What the hell is the... Okay, I didn't expect it to go that far off the rails. What the hell are you talking about, dude? No, this does not at all say might makes right. Maybe we can argue about what the well-being being of all sentient creatures could be, and that needs fleshing out. But that does not mean you could just define it as whatever you want it to be defined. I think the well-being of all sentient creatures is when I have all the stuff and nobody else has any stuff. Clearly, that is not in accordance with this paradigm, and obviously, anyone who would have this paradigm isn't going to leave it as arbitrary as, whatever well-being, we'll figure that. They have meanings behind that as well. It's so weird to like fairly accurately describe his opponent's underlying moral position in a way that his opponent didn't really, then so uncharitably respond to like the detail, the like different parts of it, and like characterize the different parts of this position. It's
best, this moral argument is abductive with
I
subjective premises.
I did not expect
and
this
also
kind of
generally
debate, let me tell
subjective
you.
presuppositions hidden inside a strong general statement of ethics. Even if we conceded that the primary moral argument is deductively sound, the subjective components will create contention upon implementation.
Yeah, because ethics is
Since this is
subjective,
at its
but
core an
subjectivity
ethical
doesn't.
debate,
Oh no, I really hope this isn't one of those like only objective things can be true, and if there's any subjectivity we reject. Yeah, ethics is always going to be subjective because it deals with subjects and the experiences of those subjects. You can't really objectively determine what harm is, for example. And so if you wanted to have an objective version of morality, you'd have to like disregard the concept of harm, which doesn't seem to work on any level. There are a lot of people like this. These are like often skeptic types. I don't know how much he's going to fall into this trap, but there are a lot of these like skeptic types where subjective means not true. This is the same kind of people who will say social construct means it's not real, or think that that's what you mean. And so we can't use it at all. Well, no, hammering out what we mean by these subjective concepts and trying to further define them is part of the project of ethical investigation. And it's such a weird thing to be like, well, it's subjective. What even is harm? It's fine if animals suffer. I don't know. It's like, okay, maybe this guy is gonna do more of like, it's fine if they suffer kind of thing. Is he gonna go to bat for factory farms? We'll see.
We cannot ignore the possibility of ethical consequences to any of the social policies that vegan activism seeks to accomplish. Is the ultimate result of what vegan activists seek to implement going to actually accomplish the goal that they seek in minimizing animal suffering? I don't think vegans tend to claim that.
Well, we haven't really got to what they seek or what it would do. Yeah, this is a really strange way to approach this, saying like, okay, let's say they got what they want. I haven't said what they want. I'm not responding to my opponent saying what he wants because my opponent hasn't. And so to be like, well, there will be ramifications. Like if you go on to say, I have a sneaking suspicion he's going to go on to say something effective like, well, there are like 3 million cows in America. I don't know how many there are a lot of fucking cows in America. If we just stopped factory farming and let them all into the wild, that would wreak havoc on the ecosystem. Like, yeah, that's true, but I don't think anyone advocated for that, and it's a really odd approach to have that be the first issue you take. I mean, obviously he hasn't said that yet, but he's talking about the problems of implementation of vegan interests, which no one has yet described. So it's left. Well, I cut him off in the middle of his thing, so we'll see what he says about it.
It's art attribute clairvoyant tendencies, and I've very rarely seen any attempt at considering economic or ecological impact of the policies they would seek to implement in order to chase.
Whoa, okay. So we're talking on way different wavelengths here. He's talking about policy implementation and the potential issues of the policies no one has described yet, whereas Alex is talking about the specifics of factory farming being a problem. We're talking past each other and no one's talking about the actual subject. This is way more ridiculous than I expected.
Standard of higher virtue.
I should let this play. We're never
Just
going
to
to get
drill
through
this
this if I
home
keep
with the
pausing this
realistic
much.
fact of the policies of veganism,
I'm gonna
is
try to
that
talk
those
over them
vegetables
more,
on your plate
so
are
we
absolutely
we
not
don't take
put
as
there
long.
devoid of animal suffering. I actually think I heard Alex concede that point in his opening. This is an online article from the Anthropocene, and in it we see an important quote that shines a light on how little effort has actually been put forward to discern the actual animal suffering impact of farmland. To quote the article, we know that animals are harmed in plant production, write
Well, this
philosophers
is
Bob
something your
Fisher and
opponent hasn't
Andy
really gotten
Laney,
into.
respectively, of Texas
Like, it's,
State
yeah, I don't know.
University
You
and the
should be responding
University
what
of
your opponent
California,
talks
San
about.
Diego.
This should be an objection raised in like either a rebuttal setting or a conversational portion where you say, okay, well, a this is a potential consequence of the type of arguments you've made. Do you also take issue with this, and then get into the problems with it? But as of right now, we don't know that Alex is in agreement with this position, or thinks that it should be therefore ended, right? Like, he's already said we should minimize the harm we cause to non-human animals as well, but he hasn't said like therefore we should end agricultural like plant production. It, so like spend any significant amount, even the amount of time we've already spent on it, is kind of putting words in your opponent's mouth. You're arguing against something he hasn't yet said
In the Journal of
and might
Agricultural
not
and
say.
Environmental Ethics. Unfortunately, though, we know very little about the scale of the problem. The truth is that I have found very few vegans actually considering if their policies and practices are ultimately
What
leading to a decrease in animal
policies?
suffering. Is it permissible in the vegan moral framework for millions of
Like maybe there's a background noise of the vegan activism that he's heard of, like what policies people have proposed, but without them coming from his opponent, we don't know if he agrees with them. There are crazy people in all sorts of activist groups. If there's one vegan activist who writes an article that's saying that like we should like exterminate the human population because we're harming animals, you could say, well, there are problems with that political policy, but Alex doesn't necessarily agree with that, and he probably wouldn't. So when no one's described what these are, yeah, it's God. Why? How are both of them just so off the mark? I don't get it.
Not billions of insects, rodents, and small herbivores to be killed in any territory that happens to be used to cultivate the vegetable staples that we will need to increase with our dependency on a vegan lifestyle. And this is justified so that a lesser number of cattle and pigs can be killed. Why is the sentient value of the life that is larger in scale prioritized over those on the smaller scale? Well, to me, because the other life is indeed just so small. It is rarely noticed and therefore rarely considered,
What?
but I think poses a major problem
Oh,
for the
okay. I don't think
primary
he
ethical
agrees.
justification of veganism.
Okay, I don't think he agrees that
Now,
smaller things are less worthy of moral consideration. I think that he's simply explaining that that is a tendency of the consideration that they get, not that it's good, just that, well, they tend to be less considered even if they shouldn't be. I don't know.
not to be morbid here, but the very presence of modern humans in any ecosystem causes some form of animal suffering, something I think I also heard Alex concede to. And taking this moral
But we're not
framework to its
talking about
absolute
abolition.
conclusion via
Yeah, you're
reductio
taking
ad
it to the
absurdum leads
extreme,
us
but
to a
nobody does.
potential justification for mass genocide of all
How is
humans
he
on Earth.
this
We as
off?
humans have decided of our own accord that it is virtuous.
This was such a slam dunk for him. How is he this off base? You're responding to things your opponent hasn't said, might not agree with, and doesn't even really follow. By the way, the problem with what he's talking about is like, oh yeah, if you take it to your logical conclusion, therefore like humans shouldn't be. But people don't follow it that far. Just because you do a small version of a thing doesn't mean you have to do the biggest possible version of that thing. Even built into Alex's opening was the statement that it is the minimal to minimize as much as possible the harm done to others, to other life. It's this could have been so easy, man. This could have been so easy, and just both of them.
For our species to propagate and spread. Yet everywhere that we do, we cause all manner of animal suffering as well as endure all manner of suffering ourselves while we implement massive suffering on other creatures.
This is by the way, that kind of like stark everything must be objective pseudo intellectualism that we see from like skeptic types, or the kinds that would exist in like 2016 kind of thing. This is how you get like really bad arguments of, you know, well, therefore, since we have to do the extreme of everything, and it's like, therefore, you should just kill all humans. Yeah. This is just a kind of a tendency of this kind of thinking. I see it all the time. I'm struggling a little bit to capture it because I have had a lot of friends who think this way, and it's hard to describe outside of an example like this one of like, no, that's not how logic works or ethics, but it's kind of a necessary way of looking at the world when you have this kind of mindset of like, well, subjective is not real and only objective matters, which he's only hinted at. I'm just getting a sense because I've seen a lot of people like this, and also there's a little bit of that telling, like Avatar, like, you know, the what was it, like the skeptic Sona, the like freaking what's his name? There are a lot of people who did these like Teal Deer and Bearing, and I mean Armored Skeptic eventually. Well, I shouldn't say eventually, but like shows his face a lot now and wasn't like opposed to that as a concept, but he falls into that category of these people who like have this like skeptical Avatar logic is another one. Just this there's something about wanting to hide behind this appearance of being suave and intelligent. Well, I guess Bearing didn't really do that, but like I don't know. There's something about like the non-you Avatar that coincides with this kind of thinking and this kind of bad argument. I'm struggling. I know I'm explaining this very poorly, but if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about.
Presented, I think it is easy to come to the conclusion that the best ultimate good to minimize all suffering is to remove humans from the environment, so that only those creatures devoid of moral agency can inflict any suffering, and humans themselves will not
like
be.
How are you so backwards in this argument where you're like, well, having a consideration of morality means we should get rid of all human, therefore your basis for veganism doesn't make sense? Like, really, if you took this kind of thinking to its logical conclusion, like these people like to do, you couldn't have ethics as a concept, because every ethical system will be like, well, humans violate it, therefore fuck all humans, am I right? No, none of this makes sense. And you could have, if you stayed on topic, if you just responded to what your opponent said, I mean, maybe he wouldn't be able to do that effectively, but this could have been so easy for both of you. We could have had such a good conversation. There was so much good stuff here, and the groundwork was there. Alex is much better at this than he showed himself to be in this debate. I don't know about this Smokey guy. I'm not getting a good sense from him, to be honest, but holy shit.
Around to experience any suffering, and therefore we have maximized well-being of morally innocent sentient life on Earth and maximally minimized the infliction of animal suffering on Earth. Granted, there is a counterpoint to this narrative that I will gladly volunteer. Humans suddenly removed from the equation would lead to mass extinction events of any animals that have come to rely.
Or maybe just a genocide of humans is a harm in itself. This is another thing that people like this don't really like factor in. Oh, it would just be good if there weren't humans then. Okay, but how do you do that without untold suffering? You can't. That is a suffering in itself. This is like this way of thinking, this approach, this like violent opposition to the concept of nuance and gradation is such a mind virus. Oh my god damn.
Rely upon humans for their ongoing survival, and many species would suffer and die off because of this.
Can't believe
no
this
more
argument's
deer in the
this
Midwest,
bad.
where humans have
Both
replaced
of
the
them.
natural predators in the ecosystem.
There are no winners
Marine
here.
ecosystems face potential ecological unbalance from thousands of years of fishing suddenly removed. No more sheep or chickens or cows, which have next to zero chance of surviving in the wild without human protection and care. In truth, removing humans from
Like,
the
he's
environment,
going on
which
and on
tends to be
about
what
it, like,
vegans universally push towards, could have severe and multifaceted.
I'd like to note that his like, this is his counter argument to veganism. Is like, well, if we agree with veganism, we have to kill all humans, and the counter argument you might have is that other animals might suffer too. Like, this is where we are.
unethical conclusions. Yet this still abides by their ultimate framework. They don't actually
No,
need to
it
deviate
doesn't.
from it. If all the animals die off, there will be no more animal suffering with those animals, and
Humans
the
are
ones left
also
alive
animals that
will
were deserving
experience
of
maximal
consideration.
well-being. So is species extinction an acceptable path to minimization of suffering?
No, and no
then
one's
why?
suggesting it
And if it is,
except
why
you.
isn't human extinction an acceptable path as well? This leads us to ask another.
This is again why, like, this is a result of like the way he's looking at the world, obviously, not a result of like his approach to a debate. But this is why, like, you can get into a lot of trouble with keeping to your scripted opening, especially when you are on negating a position and not supporting a positive one. Like, literally, what the fuck are you talking about? And this is so disconnected from, well, the world and logic, but also what your opponent was saying, that it feels like you're not talking about, well, neither of you are talking about the subject, but like it's like you're in a different debate. It's like you're arguing against a person we didn't hear speak. And it's, you shouldn't have read any of this, irrespective, even if it, maybe if it lined up with, if Alex was like, well, yeah, if Alex had his opening that was just like, yeah, therefore humans need to all die, then yeah, okay, sure, maybe this is where you go with it, but like, especially when he doesn't, you shouldn't be reading this.
Very important and fundamental question.
Is it
better
important
to
or fundamental?
so that you never suffer? Is it actually a morally
I guess
virtuous
he's taking the position that your own death can be
so
morally
that they
obligatory.
can't suffer?
Okay,
Is it better that
All
each
right,
of these
let's
creatures
do it.
get any chance at life at all, or better they not exist if that life is potentially full of suffering? While we can all
We can't
generally
be
agree
vegans,
that
otherwise
factory
we would
farming
have to
practices
euthanize
are
all
in
humans
desperate need
before
of
they're
reform,
born.
and the treatment of animals should not be socially neglected, is it better that these animals never existed than lived and suffered to be killed for the sustenance of the population? I will try to round this up with a final point and a thought experiment.
He's going to round it up here. Okay, this is another issue that I think a lot of people have. There is kind of a sense, especially with more formal debates, that your opening should be an opening that is not a response to your opponent. When you are in a position like this, where your position should be the mere negation stance, it is better form to have part of it be a rebuttal than to leave all of that to the conversation portion. This is a little bit an issue of format, and I'll contrast this by calming down a bit and discussing what competitive debate looks like, at the very least what I have done. In policy debate, it's very different. That is, from what I understand, the more prestigious, I don't know how to pronounce it, version of debate. I did Lincoln Douglas debate. It's supposed to be like more philosophical. The general structure, or I shouldn't say general structure, the structure of a debate is as follows. The affirmative, the one who is supporting the proposition, who is trying to prove their point, has 6 minutes to lay out their case. Then there's a 3-minute portion where the negative, the person who is supposed to reject that case, can cross-examine them. The only expectation is that the negative is the one allowed to ask questions, and the affirmative merely should be answering them. They shouldn't be going off at length. It's actually encouraged to cut off the other the person answering the questions if they're going on too long, and just say, like, I only have so much time, I got to get to the points. And there shouldn't be asking questions back, the affirmative, I mean. Then the negative has 7 minutes. Now you might go like, oh, that's to lay out their case. The expectation is that they spend like 3 minutes of that, 2 to 3 minutes, or I guess like 2 to 4 minutes, should be their case, because there are some arguments you can make against a proposition that don't really need to respond to your opponent, and the length of that should vary based on what much the topic is like that. If there are more arguments you can make irrespective of what the affirmative says, then you should speak longer. If there are fewer, you should speak less. And then the rest of the time is the rebuttal. The first time the negative speaks, they should already be arguing against what their opponent already said, and that should probably be the majority of their time. After that, the affirmative gets 3 minutes cross-examination, then the affirmative gets a 4-minute rebuttal, then the negative gets a 6-minute rebuttal, and the affirmative gets a 3-minute wrap-up. I just finished that out because it's, just to give you the full idea. But the point is, there's kind of it's kind of a difficulty of format where when you both have the 10-minute openings, it feels a little weird to some people, I think, to argue against what your opponent said in your opening. But for the negative, especially for a mere negation position, that's what you should be doing. That is a better use of your time as opposed to trying to fill it. And you basically begin a conversation. The affirmative lays out their case in an uninterrupted way so you can lay it all out without interruption. Like, that's kind of important. You need to have all the reasons and be able to express it in a way where ideas that work with each other can be expressed together and with that connection in mind. Like, you can lay out that connection. Then when the negative starts by has their first speech including a rebuttal, that's basically the first step of the conversation. You have said your thing, here is the response, and now we're responding to each other in turn. And that's, I think, what people should be doing in situations like this. They just kind of don't. And I think that's it's a failure of format in terms of implication. But he'll wrap it up and without really addressing what Alex said, or what anyone says, if we're being honest, for what he's actually talked about. I don't know who's out there being like, yeah, kill all humans, yeah. Maybe Bender from Futurama, but I don't think this is why. God damn it.
I can't help but notice veganism as a moral modern manifestation of cultural ethics taken to their logical termination point.
No, they're not.
It is the type of perspective that would find difficulty emerging in any social environment that didn't experience a certain level of first world comfort and excess. People starving in third world countries aren't generally having ethical disagreements with where they are getting their food. Well, the
first moment, the first time he said anything remotely reasonable, and he's just gonna slide past it and get onto his absolute nonsense. So I want to know what the fuck the two rabbits are about. It's on screen. Tell me about the two fucking rabbits.
Name the trait argument might be compelling on its surface. I'm not sure any vegan would be bold enough to claim that they think human suffering is simply potential collateral damage to the higher priority of preventing animal suffering. I look forward to
By the way, there is a little bit of this where I am curious, because I like, you could get to the heart of this very quickly. I don't think that vegans, or in this case Alex, would necessarily consider all animal suffering to be equivalent, and I do wonder if they would make arguments like lions killing gazelles for food is unethical. I don't think he would. And then you start to get into like, well, then you agree with a hierarchy of suffering or a hierarchy of importance at some level, and then maybe we can get into that. But it's kind of irrelevant, because no matter if you agree or not, this only works if you can make the Smoky Saint here would have to make the positive argument that not eating animal products would cause more suffering, or like more equivalent suffering. If you can do the math, 3 human suffering units are equivalent to 8 animal suffering units or whatever. Like, that it would cause more suffering than not, or like it's too necessary. He'd have to like prove that it's too necessary to be done away with, which I don't think that's necessarily true. And yeah, we're just like, it's too much in absolutes, too much without nuance or consideration of gradation.
Unpacking that a little bit more with Alex, because that was his challenge to me at the end. Therefore, prioritizing the well-being of animals over that of humans, yet this is what would be an unavoidable consequence of the implementation of vegan policies on social environments
as of yet
that don't have the same infrastructure or resource access.
And remember, this guy thinks that the natural consequence of vegan policies would be the genocide of human beings. I do not trust that he is accurately described. I don't think he has a good understanding what those policies are, let alone what ramifications would derive from them.
the Western world. I think veganism has been instigated by culturally emotive influence. We have been culturally conditioned to not just sympathize, but empathize with the animals around us, even going as far as to attribute human characteristics to them. We
And that's
humanize
bad
the animals around us
because
and treat their experiences as if they were human
is he
experiences,
really just
just
like
from a
fuck the
perspective of
animals?
inferior intelligence. But this is not a fundamental fact that can be proven. We assume a humanistic experience on the animal, and doing so end up
I don't
reaching a
think we
point of
do. I
attributing a
think we just
human value.
recognize
And this tends to
aspects
manifest as vegan activism
of
as I
human
perceive it.
experience in
Truth is, none of
animals.
us actually have any idea about the life experience of a lesser being, and therefore the value we
Lesser
attribute
being,
to it
dude, is
is
this
only
guy
one that
actually
we have
like, dude, fuck
subjectively
animals
supplanted
though?
onto the object. And I don't think we can ignore the idea that cultural conditioning is at play here. Many people in this country treat their pets like their quote unquote children, even
Oh
affectionately
my
refer to them
god,
as such.
he has
This
his
is not
own.
an objective
This
cultural
is
position shared in other cultures that are perfectly content to eat dogs and cats, which we find to just be beyond the
thinks
pale. This is
veganism
not
is a
because
mere
dogs and cats have some
cultural
standard of ultimate objective higher value
product.
than
Oh my
pigs and
god.
cows that are often on our dinner plates. It just means that our cultural positioning has influenced our subjective moral standards, and this is a manifestation of this. As my finishing, let's conclude with this two rabbits thought experiment.
Hit me.
Based
Let's
upon
go.
human empathetic reasoning, which of these rabbits is better off to you and living a life of quote unquote maximized
Oh
well being
no,
and
now we're gonna
minimized
try to get
suffering?
like
And I ask
objective
all the
determinations of
vegans present
subjective
here
issues, and
observing this
that
debate to
disproves
try
the
and be
concepts
honest
of
with the answer
ethics.
and
Oh,
consistent with
I'll
your
back it
living
up.
a life of quote unquote maximized well being and minimized. Which of these rabbits is better off to you and living a life of quote unquote maximized well being and minimized suffering? And I ask all the vegans present here observing this debate to try and be honest with the answer and consistent with your humanistic values given to
I
the
mean, you can be
animals to
honest with
discern
the
their
answer,
life
but it's a
perspective.
dishonest question
Imagine yourself
already
as
from the
rabbit number
outset.
one. You are born in the wild. You will spend your entire life most likely never interacting with a human being. Every night you run out of your hole and try to desperately find some food that you can eat before one of the plethora of predators in the environment comes to kill and consume you. Night after night you live in fear and anticipation of the fact that this very well could
Wait, I thought you can't know what's going on in the mind of in the experience of a lesser being. Now they're like living in fear. Okay.
be the last time you leave your cold, dank dirt hole to scamper around as a hopping dinner plate for any predator in striking distance that you failed to notice. No guarantee of a long life here, higher probability you will become dinner or wander too far from uncommon territory and maybe become roadkill, or maybe wander onto a farmer's farm attracted by the young, fresh suits of corn and soy to be eradicated for threatening the supply of the essential and primary food source of the vegan
Dude,
society
load
you have
this
been born
more.
into.
Come on, get
You
to
will
it.
watch all your brothers and sisters and rabbit friends eaten up and torn apart as you make up the primary predatory food staple of most ecosystems the world over. Now, conversely, consider yourself as rabbit number two. You are born in a family farm that raises rabbits for meat. You never experience the fear of being preyed upon, only occasional visits from a large creature to provide food that you don't have to go risk your life searching for. You are fed and content until you are fat and prepared to be slaughtered. You are
Notice how much he's loading into this. This is kind of the flip of Alex did it in a different way. It's just without a thought experiment. Instead, it was just describing current conditions. Where he's loading into it like, oh, you know, you're content and happy and it's all is good, and as opposed to being out in the wild, which is terrifying, and all your friends die around you. Like, yeah, I don't know.
taken from your enclosure, put on a block, and quickly dispatched with a strike to the neck in the most humane fashion possible. If you are
Now
one
we're
of the
talking past each
rabbits
other
that
because, of
happens to
course, Alex went on at length about the problem of factory farms. I don't know if he would necessarily accept this kind of thought experiment, given that he seems to have taken the position that only factory farms are like a thing that occur, and that like ethical farm and like they never die painlessly, and they never live contented lives, which yeah, it's like we're both only engaging in both sides are only engaging in examples or thought experiments that maximize the intuitive intuitive amount that they're correct. Like everything is in their favor. The closest we got to something not like this is when Alex was saying like how many thing like what aspects of a human would you have to change before you're comfortable killing it, or what farming situation could be ethical, like where killing the animal is part of the situation. He came close to something engaging with some of the some of the difficulties of the position, but this is well, yeah, if it's always like, what would be better, to live out in the wild where you die in your first day, on like your first day where you're able to hop around because a predator eats you, or living a long and happy life and only being killed right before you would have died anyway, and you were happy the whole time with no problems? Like, okay, there's a lot of stuff, too many variables that you're stacking in your favor for this to be really effective.
Be spared for meat and make it to an older age, you can enjoy the extended pain and suffering of debilitating age-related diseases and have your carcass completely wasted and rendered useless. So, which of these animals, from this consistent human empathized perspective, actually is ultimately and maximal potential well-being
I think I've
and
explained
maximal
why this is a
potential
bad thought
minimization
experiment
of
anyway.
suffering? And with that, I will yield.
Hopefully, for the love of God, we
Thank you
get
very
something
much,
better in
Smokey.
the
We
back
will
and forth.
get
If we
into
don't,
the open
I'm gonna
discussion
be done
section.
with
So
this,
as
because I
mentioned,
think we've
folks, this will be
engaged with
roughly
this enough
25
to
minutes or
see
so, and then we'll get into
if they're not gonna
that.
actually
So,
argue with each
thank you,
other,
gentlemen.
we've
The
gotten
floor
about
is
as
all
much of this
yours.
as we can.
Okay, why not? Let's take these one by one. You began, Smokey, by saying that animal
Okay, we're actually
suffering is
engaging with
present
arguments.
in
Let's go.
vegetable production, in plant-based farming, and therefore, how can I justify caring about the lives of pigs more than the animals which are killed in plant-based agriculture? Are you not aware that the vast majority of plants and vegetables that we grow are in fact fed to livestock? So yes, plant-based farming produces animal suffering, but we have two choices. We either produce some animal suffering by growing plants,
but now you're
and eating
leaning
the
into
plants.
it. Oh my God. So I get where he's coming from. Of like, we can reduce that suffering by reducing the amount of agriculture, of plant-based agriculture, because we won't need it as much if we don't do animal farming. However, this is like already a guy who's like, well, extrapolate that to the extreme. Wouldn't we minimize that even more if we just didn't produce any crops and just let humans die? Wouldn't that be better? And like, no, obviously not. But you're engaging too much. You're accepting too many of the terms.
Or we grow even more plants because it takes more plants to feed livestock than it takes to feed a human being. We grow even more plants, creating more suffering. We then take those plants, feed them to livestock, kill the extra livestock, which produces even more suffering.
I think this could be a good
Would you not
argument, by
agree
the
that
way,
eating the
if it
plants
were
directly would
not in
minimize suffering?
response to this bad argument.
Well, in a way, yes, but I feel like there might be a hidden premise in there that's kind of not maybe being addressed, which is that would you believe that there would have to be an increase in the amount of farmland being used and maintained in order to maintain the standard of the amount of
Well,
food
no,
that
he
was
actually
being
responded
provided
to
by
that directly, but
the
sure.
animals, or do you think it's kind of a wash?
No, I think land use, or the considerations of land use, leans us firmly in the direction of veganism. A study from
Yeah, he's already mentioned that livestock require more agricultural, more plants, or more plant agriculture to survive than humans do, and that just makes sense, right? Like, a cow weighs a lot more than a human. A cow eats a lot more than a human, and yes, we would have to eat more. We would have to eat more plants to survive if we didn't eat meat, but the proportional amount would be much, much lower. I mean, it's like built into what he said already. And now we're getting into studies. Okay.
My own University of Oxford, in the Department of Zoology and School of Geography and Environment, conducted by Joseph Poor, showed that if the world were to convert to veganism, we'd free up about 75% of current agricultural land in use. Around 50% of arable land in the United States is dedicated to animal agriculture. We are, in fact, already growing, as well as this, enough crops to feed the world's population around about 3 times over, but we take those crops and we feed them to livestock, and we eat the livestock. It takes more crops to
Given
feed
what we're
livestock
arguing
than
about,
it takes
this is
to
a
feed
good
human
argument.
beings, which means that if we're currently growing enough crops to feed livestock, to feed 70 billion...
That said, and we'll distract from this cavalcade of bad argumentation, good arguments in response to bad arguments, to mention something that's kind of relevant to what he's talking about. He's saying, like, okay, we produce enough fruits and vegetables and agriculture, or plant-based agriculture, to feed the entire human population 3 times over. And he's saying, like, well, okay, a lot of that goes to feeding livestock, which is a problem. One thing to note about that is this is also a problem of allocation that comes up with capitalism, because a lot of food that could be eaten is simply left to rot or thrown away because the people who need it to survive don't have enough money to pay. It's not profitable for them to have it, unless they pay for it, which they might not be able to afford, and people go hungry, despite the fact that there is enough to go around. This is kind of a problem of premise that I think capitalism has. Is it makes sense when when something is scarce to have a system by which you can allocate those resources. It makes sense. If there's not enough food to go around, you have to figure out who gets and who doesn't. There's no way around it, or like maybe everyone gets a little less. You have to have a system to solving this. And capitalism is an attempt at solving that system. And economic systems in general are attempts at solving that system. But it is a failure of capitalism in particular, and maybe other systems would have the same issue. Well, I definitely like feudal systems would have similar issues, where once the issue of scarcity is solved for, and with food, it is the earth produces more food than we need every year, but people still go hungry because the system is failing to account for a lack of scarcity. People could eat, and they don't, because they don't have access to it, because it doesn't make the person who owns the land more money, or owns the farm more money, and that's a failure. That is a demonstrable harm of the system. And it's not really on topic, but it's a good moment to talk to mention this, where solving for scarcity is normally a good thing, but in capitalism is actually really bad. This is why we have issues of automation, of like, oh, people want to have jobs. Well, that's fine, right? Because more work is being done with less effort. But the problem is, if you can't sell your labor, then you won't have money and you can't survive. Because once the scarcity goes away, the system starts to break.
Livestock, animals per year, then we definitely are growing enough crops to feed 7 or 8 billion people across a lifetime. Would you not agree?
So, at a certain point, I actually kind of could agree. Would
I really
you
hope we
say
get into
that
like
then,
some
in the
philosophical
path
arguments at some
of
point in
the
this podcast,
ethical maximization of this environment, there would have to be either a mass slaughter, a mass culling, or an allowing of a mass dying out
So that's also
of
not
the
true.
farm animal?
This is something that hasn't really come up, and maybe Alex will address this, but that's not true at all. The transition to a more vegan society could be done gradually, where you simply don't produce as many animals. Right, a lot of the animals are like, there's a lot of forced impregnation, and a lot of like making sure you have enough livestock being born to replace, and yada yada, etc. In a transition to more vegan society, you could simply just produce fewer and fewer over time, and gradually, a lot, like, yes, it'd be a mass death event in the sense that we already have mass death events constantly, that these animals are dying a lot, but if you simply have few of don't force as many of them to be born, because we won't need them as much, you don't have to do this mass culling. They will just be fewer with time, and fewer until the point where you don't have to, where we're not regulating at all the amount to which they reproduce. They can live more free, which would be better in and of itself. But then you also don't have to slaughter all these animals at once. And if you did, you could like theoretically argue that, okay, like now we can turn all of that into like, here's the like global feast of, we don't eat meat anymore. Everybody has like takes home like tons and tons of meat to eat, and then once that's done, like, now we don't make more. Even that mass death event, if it were necessary, which it isn't, could be worked into, it could find a workable solution. But this is very regimented, we must do everything in the maximum logical conclusion version of it that I was mentioning with the skeptic types, which the Smoky Saint is more and more making me think that he is.
That make up this part of the system.
No, it would be a case of preventing the breeding of them into existence.
Okay.
So
He immediately says
what you mean by
exactly
dying
that.
out. Of course, we're not going to go around and genocide any species. You actually asked the question.
He's like very
about
against
whether species
genocide. He's
extinction
made
is a
it
bad
clear.
thing, and if it is not, then why human extinction wouldn't be a bad thing. I don't think extinction is intrinsically bad. No, species as a whole, considered as a group, cannot be harmed. What matters is individual experience when we're talking about.
For what it's worth, I want to clarify this. I would agree. extinction is not necessarily bad, but you need a little explanation in other contexts, so I'll flesh that out here. I don't think it makes sense. I don't think it would have made sense for Alex to go into why more thoroughly like I'm about to. So it's not like a failure, but the explanation is basically extinction happens all the time. It's neither good nor bad. Dinosaurs went extinct. It happens. The method, of course, is what matters a lot. If it's through a genocide, that'd be pretty bad. If it's because naturally the species simply could, wasn't fit for its environment and naturally adopt, these are just the way things are, as opposed to be like a morally good or bad thing. Like, I don't know that I could say that the meteor impact that killed so many dinosaur species was a moral wrong. It doesn't even make sense to talk about in those terms. But if it's done through intentional harm towards the species, then yeah, it would be bad. Just for clarity there.
Ethics. If we stop breeding animals into existence and they go extinct, I don't think the extinction is a bad thing in itself. If we were to genocide human beings, that would be a proactive decision that we'd make. It wouldn't be a case of just choosing to stop breeding ourselves.
Okay, for as bad as his opening was, Alex is returning a bit to form with his ability to make good arguments in the conversation portion here. This is what we talked about a little bit before of like, okay, it's well and good to pretend like, oh, the logical extension is to kill all humans, which it's not. But make to say out loud, yeah, that would be a harm. That genocide is a harm that has to factor into what is creating, which options create the most harm, and you can't really get away from that.
Into existence. But I believe if we chose to do that, if all human beings on planet Earth decided to just stop breeding, it wouldn't be an intrinsically bad thing. Of course not.
Yeah, well, right. Like if they could poof out of existence, but that's not really an option on the table, and so it would require a mass genocide, which is among the many reasons this is not a vegan position. It's like vegans don't think we should kill all humans.
Can you appreciate the idea that maybe at a certain level you are assuming a certain life path of all of these animals almost collectively, like
no.
Minimizing them breeding and stuff. There's going to be a whole lot of animals that will be born and delivered and make it on ranches and farms or preserves or whatever, that won't necessarily suffer as much or suffer at all in the terms of factory farming, but those creatures will not exist in this paradigm where you've kind of
like the non-existence isn't a harm, right?
I guess I'm saying there are creatures that will experience suffering, but there's also
like theoretically, Smokey, you could right now be trying to impregnate as many people as possible and create more life because their non-existence, because otherwise they wouldn't exist, but that non-existence isn't a harm that should compel you to do something like that. They're not being harmed because they don't exist, and their theoretical existence isn't something that we should have impacts to.
Creatures that will experience, the benefit of the life experience, which they will be deprived because now of this.
We'll see. Now he's talking about being deprived. This is like some abortionist type arguments, but even extrapolated past that of they're not even conceived. These are theoretical animals that could exist, and you're trying to say they're being harmed by not existing. Well, no, they're not being harmed. They don't exist. What harm is being done to them? They're not real. And why? And if you were to believe that kind of thing, which obviously this is the kind of well, I don't believe it. But don't. Yeah, it's like this. It's a very disingenuous argument. But if you believe that, you should be spending every moment of every day trying to make more babies because otherwise you're harming them in their non-existence by not letting them exist.
Various sanctuaries across the world who are currently providing a perfectly amiable life for animals, some who are saved from factory farming without having to kill them at the end. The question I would ask is whether you think the same position, which you would have to agree
and for what it's worth, from the openings, we're getting to the conversational portion of factory farming bad, therefore veganism, versus veganism requires human genocide, so it bad. These are the arguments that we have on the table. God damn it.
To be consistent on this point would apply to human beings. I could breed a human being into existence with the express purpose of wanting to kill that human being for the sake of satiating my cannibalistic desires. Now, I could argue when I grow that human being to 18 years of age and kill them painlessly, by the way, they don't know it's coming. I kill them without their knowing, and I do it in the most painless way
I think this
possible.
is a good argument
Which is granting the
against the
too much,
killing
by
of
the way,
animals.
because we don't kill
This
animals
is
in
not
the most painless
all the
way
way to
possible.
veganism,
But let's say I killed that
but
human being in the most painless
it
way
is
possible. You
the first
would,
step
I
you
assume,
have to
think I
do.
don't have the right
It's
to
a
do
very
so.
good
But I
one.
could quite easily turn around and say, but listen, if I did not have the intention to kill this person, to cannibalize their flesh, then they would never have lived in the first place. If I knew that I couldn't ethically do this, then I wouldn't have bred them into existence. And surely a life of 18 years, living a good life, having a fairly average life, is worth, having to be killed by me when I turn 18. Now, it may be the case that, genuinely speaking, yes, it is better to have that life than to not have that life. But it does not follow from that you have the moral right to take that person's life. What you have done, and I'm afraid to say you did this with the rabbit example as well, is presented a false dichotomy. You say, would you rather be a rabbit who suffers in the wild, or suffers a lot less in domesticated on a domesticated farm and then dies at the end?
So he's clearly able to identify a false dichotomy. This is what I mean. He's a smart guy. Like, yes, the false dichotomy of that he's well, I'll let him lay it out. But as opposed to the false dichotomy of factory farming or veganism, right? What if there is farming that is not as cruel, or veganism, or including that, eating any animal products or killing animals, which isn't a dichotomy either. He didn't make one single argument against eating animal or consuming animal products except to condemn factory farming. And so it's kind of interesting. He doesn't notice the false dichotomy that he's laid out of only factory farming is possible in his worldview.
Not the only two options. Sure, I would rather be the second rabbit. I've got no problem accepting that. But you know what kind of rabbit I'd rather be is a rabbit who lives in that domesticated farm and doesn't get killed at the end. And if you're worried,
so I wonder then, like, from saying, like, I'd rather be a rabbit that lives in that farm that doesn't get killed. So then, like, you'd have to be pretty okay with the example I laid out of, like, my girlfriend's parents who have chickens and eat their eggs, right? But that is expressly contrary to the idea of veganism. The only problem you seem to have with animal products is the way they're produced and not that they're produced, which seems kind of antithetical to your position.
An incentive to produce these kinds of farms, and I'll remind you that the farms that are producing the animal products which we're consuming are already being propped up by government subsidies. If we were to redivert that money into sanctuary or wildlife preservation, if you're worried about wild animal suffering as well,
cool.
We'd have more than enough money to satiate that demand. But before we get sidetracked, because we've moved from one point onto another.
Could I just touch on the false dichotomy claim for just real quick, just to answer it?
Would you mind if just before you did, because we've moved on to another point here.
Sure, go ahead.
Your first point was that animals die in vegetable production, and therefore there's kind of an inconsistency, or at least a kind of unresolved ethical dispute here about why we should value those animals less than we value pigs and cows.
Right.
Would you accept that because the majority of vegetables and plants grown are in fact fed to livestock, that point doesn't stand?
Well,
I like pressing
not particularly, because to me, in the instance that the
but
animals, what you have is a massive number of them. Now I can concede the idea of, let's say this, like I haven't looked at those exact papers you're referencing to say that if we suddenly out of nowhere eliminated the feeding of livestock, all of this land would be freed up for, wouldn't actually even be needed for the cultivation of food. You're saying, I think, could be given back to nature. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, at least in theory,
it
doesn't really matter.
Farmland, we could actually use less farmland, and then we could give it more to nature, and that would be more of a natural environment.
Well, we could do all sorts of things with that.
Well, what he's saying is that we wouldn't be causing the harm that you're laying out. Maybe other harms would be caused, and that would be bad, and we'd have to address those. But the harm that you pointed out with using it for agriculture would not be necessary anymore, and we could stop doing that. And if it, you have to do a little bit of assuming that, like, we live in a culture that won't use it for something worse. Like, you could theoretically be like, yeah, but then we'd use it for, like, concentration camps, and that would be bad. Like, yeah, sure, but then we'd have to argue against that thing as well. Like, we should be working towards the minimalization of harm in many regards, but it seems a little weird to be like, well, we'll see what he says about it. But like, I don't have to assume anything. I just have to say, like, point out we can minimize the harm you illustrated by not doing that thing as much, and we wouldn't need to do that thing as much if we didn't need to feed all this livestock.
Land, and it's not my opinion there. It's the opinion of the most comprehensive study ever conducted on the relationship between agriculture and the environment. Found that 75% of land could be no longer needed if we switch to a plant-based agricultural system.
Well, but if the ethical argument is following that is the justification, then isn't there a bit of a consequential demand to kind of say like, well, whatever it's used for won't be an environment?
No, okay, I knew he was gonna. I fucking knew it. I knew he was gonna get there. Yeah, no, it has absolutely nothing to do whatsoever. It like because now Smokey, you're arguing both sides of the point. You're saying like all this harm is caused, so why don't you care? And it's like, well, I do care, and I think we should reduce that. And you're like, but maybe more harm will be caused if we don't do it. Like, do you think it's harmful or not? If your actual position is less harm is being done with it being used to feed livestock than whatever else it would be used for, that's insane to me. But also, you'd have to demonstrate that. You can't just say, well, you don't know for sure it won't. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
What it was previously used for. Isn't that something
they'll
that
all become we're going to turn all that land into laser arcades? Okay, that's what we're going to do with it. Only good will happen from it. People will have fun. Kids will have a great time. That's the only thing that will happen. Can we act like that? Like, can we stop pretending like, no, we might use it for like, we're going to use it for torture chambers exclusively? Like, I don't know.
I mean, if you're making the argument that ethically, this land is better off this way, then shouldn't you kind of have almost a burden of proof to say what it's going to be used for, and if that
no, you don't, not even a little. What you mentioned this
suffering.
Yeah, I mean, I don't particularly care what we use the land for. There's no
That's not
obligation
a great answer,
for us
but yeah.
to dedicate it to efforts for rewilding. I know a lot of vegans suggest that would be a good idea. I'm not particularly on board with that because I think the wild animal suffering needs to be taken into account. But for all I care, you can turn it into a car park. The point is that
a parking lot's kind of a bad example because parking lots are pretty environmentally destructive, but the point remains, right? You can just it will be used for a thing. We can assume it's a morally neutral thing. That would be fair. Not to say that it will necessarily do a positive good in the world, but we can't assume it will be a harm. And Alex definitely doesn't have to prove that it wouldn't be used for something more harmful. That'd be insane.
The point about land usage, but also about vegetable production. Because I can tell you that it is simply a fact that the majority of plants grown are used to feed livestock. And so if your original argument, or your first argument, I should say, was that by growing these vegetables and deciding to kill these animals was somehow not actually minimizing suffering in an ethically sensible way, does not the fact that the majority of these plants that are grown are being fed to livestock completely dismiss what you've said there?
Okay, I think I might possibly be able to concede your point if we discern the presupposition
cool.
inside.
We never see
that. I guess that
debate.
has to do with its policy implementation. Because I mean, I guess in a way, it's good to sit and say it would be really nice if the clouds were made of cotton candy. But that doesn't tell us how to do that, type thing. So I'm wondering,
but nobody's like suggesting
in your mind,
we're talking
just
about
from your perspective.
Okay,
and then
this is a thing that happens a lot. People like to people who call themselves like pragmatists like to do this thing where they're like, well, we can't talk about moral obligation unless we talk about the ramifications of the policy. Well, we have to first establish the thing we want to do, then get to how we would do it. If we don't agree that it's something that's good to do, it doesn't really matter what the policies. Like if veganism isn't morally obligatory, then the policies don't really. It doesn't really matter what suggested policies and what issues there are with the proposed policies that would support veganism writ large. It doesn't matter because we've already determined that we don't need to try to meet this obligation. And then once we do, then we can talk about how best to do it. It's kind of skipping the question at hand. I remember seeing someone else do it in another context. I won't go into that because that's a hell of a digression, but I have seen this come up several times before.
I'd like to go back to the false dichotomy thing. But in your mind, in your perspective, in terms of a application of policy to
Oh, we're never
manifest
getting
what,
through
what
this.
you're perceiving as the highest, social, ethical virtue, what are you kind of proposing as should be done? Are you saying it needs to be
Doesn't matter.
argued as a cultural dynamic and people need to change their minds slowly over time? Or is it something that requires some sort of hardline governmental infrastructure
It
change
doesn't
or
matter.
challenge?
Both. Neither.
I wouldn't advocate for any kind of government or infrastructure change, because I think that legitimate government must be based on the consent of the people, and therefore you would need to have a critical mass of people who agree with the
Okay,
philosophy in order
beautiful.
to legitimately make the government do that. What I would say is,
Smokey is saying like beautiful as Alex is laying this out. It makes me wonder like, was your assumption that this was going to be through like the force of the state dictatorially imposing that? Like that's so weird that this also is a thing that the skeptic types will do is like, oh, you want a thing, that must mean you want to do it through violence and force and not through convincing people. Like it seems like he's assuming that he had assumed prior to that moment that this is how Alex wanted it to be done. And it's like, well, yeah, you could oppose literally any policy if you assume that will only ever happen in the worst possible way.
that well, no, I don't want to kind of take up too much time if you want to talk about
No,
the
that's fine.
false
No, in
dichotomy.
fact, we can carry from that. That's beautiful. That's a beautiful answer. Thank you for that. So, could we kind of almost discern and think that the culture would have to change from what's currently been, maybe you
That's
would agree
why
with this, a
we're having
prioritization
this
of
debate.
keeping a cheap availability of meat has conversely been a catalyst to the inferior treatment of animals.
It's
I don't know
partly
about
that, but it's not
because.
just that, because even if it wasn't a drive to produce actually cheap meat, it still remains the fact that the principal driving motive of the animal agricultural industry is profit, regardless of the cost of the meat
Well,
in the long
all
run. Even if
industries,
we envision a world in which animals are killed much less and are therefore much more expensive, it's still going to be driven by profit. And wherever profit is involved in the commodification of a living being, you can ensure that suffering will exist.
So I don't know if Alex is a socialist or if he or his views concerning like what economic system should exist or whatever else. Or I think he's pretty left leaning, but I'm not exactly. Well, he's already talking about should come through the consent of the governed. So at a minimum, he is liberal or further left. So I don't really know where he lands on this, but this is where I'm starting to be like, yeah, the problem's capitalism, bro. That's the problem. The actual problem is capitalism, and you could make arguments that meat eating would be a problem in any system because, as we mentioned before, the killing of animals is a harm being caused in the world, and we don't need to be doing it. But I wonder if he's avoiding talking about it being capitalism, just talking about the profit motive because it's a little off topic. But I want to mention it, and you can't stop me. There's nothing you can do. I can't be stopped.
Right. Well, I can agree with that. And I think that's even one of my concerns on some of these, ethical dilemmas of whether or not this ends up being a unanimous cultural decision. Because
Okay,
I,
so
I think
now it
part
needs
of
to
the
be
problem, one of
unanimous. What
the
the fuck?
side effects
Oh,
that I
is
could
this?
see, and I guess
Oh,
it's
it's another
two-part. I'll
instance
give
of
you
like the
both and kind of
skeptic
like,
types being like, democracy is good if everyone agrees, but otherwise it's the tyranny of the majority. And it's like, ugh, god damn it.
respond
We'll
to
let
it.
him talk, but
The
I'm seeing the
transition from
seeds.
the environment, even assuming the cultural accepted it, you now have all of this livestock that will take some time to, well, as I guess, die out type thing. So we are still going to be feeding that livestock for a period of time and also having a demand for now the food to supplant all the stuff that the livestock is now not providing. So could you concede that there would be a perceivable issue of a window of time where policy implementations of how this actually functions on a societal level might be a bit of a challenge?
Yeah, it could be
No,
challenging, but
for
it
a
has
few reasons.
nothing to
First
do with
being
what
that
we're talking about.
you mentioned the last thing you mentioned, take them in reverse, as you said that we would have to kind of replace if we're no longer kind of using these animals, we'd need to replace the food that we would get from them with plants.
Well,
But
and
bear in mind,
with a mild clarification, and not just the food, but I would say also all the things that are animal byproducts that make their way into very, very common plethora of day-to-day products. Like there's also would now be a need to find plant-based versions of things to replace those things that we normally
So
have
now we're getting
as
into like
animal
now
byproducts.
we're off topic again. Now we're not talking about whether it's more like just like, but how would you do the thing? It's any problem. So I'll just say it. I'll just have a blanket statement here. Any proposal, any policy proposal that Alex lays out, and any problems that exist with it, are can be uh, dismissed, or like the problems with those policies could be dismissed very easily when you simply realize we can just say, okay, then that's not the way we do it. It would, but no matter what the problems are, and no matter what proposals he suggests, would not change whether veganism is morally obligatory. The only way it could change it is if it were literally impossible to do it in an ethical way. Like to switch over societally to a vegan one in an ethical way, which I don't know how you could ever prove. It's just we're just off topic. We're just not talking.
Just to
well, it
clarify
wouldn't.
talking
that,
about
sorry.
what
Yeah,
we're
I mean, it
supposed to
wouldn't
be
be a
talking
place of
about.
finding them because we already have a plethora of plant-based alternatives to any of the necessities or pleasantries of life. It's just a case of implementing them. The question that you ask is whether this will happen overnight, or separately, whether I'd want this to happen overnight. Realistically, it's not going to. I recognize that by convincing people, morally speaking, to stop paying for the breeding and torture and confinement of animals, what will
He's back
happen
on
is
that
these
again.
animals will be bred into existence less and less as the economic demand depletes.
Yeah.
And so we don't have to worry about what's going to happen to the animals because the animals are still going to be eaten. It's just that there's going to be less brought into existence. But suppose I grant you a hypothetical situation in which everybody goes vegan overnight. What do we do with the animals? Well, the answer is probably something along the lines of euthanization. I think that would have to be the case. Now, you may say that doesn't sound very vegan to be in favor of killing animals, but
Yeah,
here's the
probably.
point: these animals are bred to die. Right, the moment that they're bred into existence, an ethical atrocity has already been committed, and that these animals have been condemned to a terrible fate. And the question that we would have is whether we kill these animals to prevent future generations from continuing to suffer in the same way, or we allow them to continue multiplying and suffering in the same
But
way.
this
And I
is
think
kind
it's a
of off.
perfectly vegan, bearing in
This
mind that
doesn't
veganism
matter.
is about the minimization of suffering in the long run, to euthanize these animals. But in reality, we wouldn't have to have that very difficult and nuanced ethical discussion because that's not how it's going to work. What's going to happen is we're going to stop breeding these animals into existence, so we don't have to worry about that at all. It doesn't even come up in the conversation. I find it very strange.
Too much Smokey was think. Oh, Alex might be about to say the same thing. Too much Smokey is like thinking in these absolutes of like, well, because you say that everyone will go vegan overnight, won't we have to slaughter every one of these animals and then do a genocide? And it's like, well, no. Like, why do you think that would? Why do you think like this? Why do you think that that's how anything would be? As of right now, people eat a lot of meat. It takes a lot of discussion about the subject. How long has veganism been something that people have pushed for? And over time, hopefully, there are more vegans and people eat less meat, and you just don't have to breed as many of these animals. Okay, where's the? Yeah.
How people will simultaneously argue, on the one hand, about
Oh, he's not
species
talking about
extinction. They'll say that these animals are going to go extinct if we don't keep breeding them into existence. But on the other hand, they say that if we stop eating them, they're going to overrun us and there are going to be too many and we won't know what to do with them. It's like we need to make our mind
That
up
is a
here, which is it
contradiction
going
that
to be.
occurs, but
Well, and if I
it's
may,
not
just to
super.
touch on that, because
It's
that's
not
a
a good
beautiful
argument.
point.
It's not that relevant.
You know,
I think.
there is an example I brought up just in periphery in my opening, which is the example of the deer in the Midwest. You know, what's happened is, of course, the humans living there have replaced, the primary predators in the ecosystem as the humans moved in and settled. You know, things like wolves and cougars and bobcats. These things are a danger to the cultivation of livestock like sheep and cows and stuff like that. So they would kill off a lot of the primary predators. So now there's a lack of predators to prey upon the sheep. The white-tailed deer, I believe it is. So if humans were suddenly removed from the equation of hunting them because hunting them is ethically wrong, well, then they would die out. But I don't generally see vegans, thinking that the life experience of a deer is so necessarily painful or bad that it should be wiped out of existence and rendered extinct. That life
There's a lot of like
experience of the
thinking
deer
in absolutes again. There might
opposed
be
to
problems
also
with
being
like
hunted, whether it's being hunted by what was its
extinction. I don't
primary
know.
predator, wolves or bobcats. It's now had a primary predator replace it.
This is of course like getting back to what Alex was saying about not all extinctions are necessarily bad. Like it's kind of a neutral thing. If we stop killing them just because we want to kill them, and they end up going extinct, like that's just kind of like sure. I do like the position that Smokey is hinting at, that humans, we often think of ourselves as relevantly distinct from what happens naturally. In fact, we'll talk about like, oh, it's unnatural because it's human made, as if humans are not part of the natural order, are not animals ourselves. And while we do things that other animals don't do, the discussion of humans replacing the natural predators of deer does talk about it in kind of a naturalistic way, which is really interesting. However, being natural doesn't make it good, and one thing that we know humans can do is reason morally, and if it's immoral, it doesn't matter that we're simply replacing something in the natural order. We're doing something wrong. And the question is, well, is that replacement necessarily wrong, and what justification do we have for it, so on and so forth.
Inside the ecosystem. So where in that particular dynamic does the kind of moral atrocity follow?
Oh, I want to make sure I completely understand the exact question you're asking, because you've kind of spoken a little bit about ecosystems and deers, but I'm not sure exactly what the question is.
Well, like I would say that the ultimate, vegan ethical framework is kind of, it's not ever good to kill animals unless it's justifiable, right? Like, I mean, you have a suffering animal that's in need of euthanasia. It's not considered morally virtuous to allow it to continue to suffer. Like kind of like your two two-legged pig thing in the gas chamber. Like, well, if it was a pig and it had two legs, is it suffering? Maybe it needs to be in the gas chamber, not to make it morbid. But I'm saying, I think that at a certain level, we almost have that ethical pull of realizing an animal in suffering allowing that to continue isn't virtuous. It's not good. I think any of us can be turned into
this. I think comes from a kind of a position of like dominion over animals. Like if there was an animal in the wild that was like suffering for whatever reason, like should a human come and kill it? Well, it's like this idea that we should be the arbiter of that, and we should probably maybe Alex might say something to the effect of like we should leave these things to their own and maybe not get involved. And if it ends up suffering, it ends up suffering. But I'm not so sure. Yeah, I'm not really sure. That's kind of a weird one. I'll be honest, I'm running out of steam a little bit here because this has been quite a long time to review Not a Lot, and a lot of what we have reviewed has been just so off the rails. So I'll keep going for a little bit, but if I get too weary of this, I don't mind cutting off in the middle. That seems to be kind of a thing that we do because I just don't stop talking.
If we happen to accidentally run over an animal, you know what I'm saying? Like if we run over an animal and the animal's laying there suffering, I don't think we're the type of like, oh, I can't handle this, I'm emotionally downtrodden, I have to leave. Like, you almost feel that ethical pull. Like, well, you're either going to help it.
I guess
I
have a question of like,
misery, because that
is it good
ethical position
to kill
right?
something that is suffering?
Okay.
I think we assume it is
drawing
like
from
putting it out of
that
its misery
to the
phrase,
perspective of
but I'm less
where
certain
we are
now,
drawing the
and
line
I have to do more thinking
in the
about
argument of the justification of the animal suffering. I'm sorry, I led that in a really roundabout circle.
Well, I mean, that there are a few things to say here. Firstly, is that this is obviously a different topic from the food consumption that we've been.
Now we care about what's a different subject.
But that's fine. This is what happens when you do these things in a conversational style. I would kind of that there's a lot of things that need to be considered when it comes to things like hunting, especially like deer population. Bearing in mind that like
this feels also off
in many
topic,
ways, or in pretty much all ways,
subject of veganism,
human cause.
Way off topic.
Predators hunt prey in the wild, they tend to prey on the weakest. That's kind of how it happens. Natural selection works such that like the weaker die out, the stronger survive, and so as the deer population evolves, so does the prey. But hunters tend to go for the strongest. They tend to go for the ones with the big antlers, with the bulky frame, and all of this kind of stuff. So we're disrupting the ecosystem.
As a note about that, I'm sure this is something most people know about, but elephants have had smaller and smaller tusks over the decades since humans started hunting them for sport more, because the ones with big tusks get hunted and they don't procreate, and so the smaller ones, it's just like this kind of inverse selection, or what we might think of as inverse selection, of just natural selection towards smaller tusks because they get killed less often for it.
By in not a particularly natural way, by going in and doing so. There's also, not many people know this, 4,000 or thereabouts deer farms in the United States, which are breeding deer into existence, many of whom are specifically used for hunting, right? It's not like hunters are going into the wild.
I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
For the sake of the ecosystem and because they care about the environment. I've never seen a hunter post a photo on his Facebook profile outside a recycling bin. You know, it's not about ecosystem prevention. If it were, then there wouldn't be these deer farms that are breeding deers into existence for the sake of wanting to kill them, as well as clear cutting, a practice in which state
really
wildlife management agencies are cutting down vast expanses of forestry to procure the kind of edge habitats which are favored by deer, in order that hunters can then go and hunt them. You'll probably be familiar with the Yellowstone situation, in which hunting is now banned because of the absolute catastrophe that it had on the ecosystem, in that hunters were killing the wolves, leading to an overpopulation of deer, and wolves had to then be reintroduced just to balance out the ecosystem. In other words, I don't think we have a very good history of going into nature as hunters, killing animals by shooting them in the lung, taking them out of that system, right? Which, by the way, changes the metabolic cycle of the entire process of an animal dying and being eaten, not just by the predator who killed it, but also other animals who are scavenging off the remains. We completely disrupt this ecosystem by killing that animal and taking it out of nature. I don't think that it's a very strong argument to say that by hunting these animals, we're somehow prioritizing environmentalism or ecosystem balancing, especially due to the development of things like chronic wasting.
I think
disease,
Alex's argument is a good one.
Disease,
I just wish we were talking about veganism.
Deer and elk and moose, and is ravaging the wild deer population, largely due to the fact that these deer are being bred in farms in order that hunters can go and kill them for sport. So yeah, I'm not sure I'm entirely sold on this line of argumentation.
Well, I guess I'm not particularly arguing for the absolutist versions of that implementation.
You've been absolutist this whole time. Now you don't want to. Okay.
Micro environments set up for the prize hunting of animals, and I think that might be a slightly different ethical conclusion. I understand where you're coming from, and I guess I almost could concede it a little bit, if almost you could concede it a little bit on my side, that there is still kind of a little bit of a philosophical stretch.
This is a hell of a nitpick, but I've been looking at this animation on Smokey Saint's side for so long that I can't help but notice that it doesn't loop. It doesn't loop naturally. You can see where it breaks and then starts over, and it's very frustrating to me. Of like, this is what you're gonna do, and it does look like decently cool. Just try to get an animation that loops, or if you made it yourself, make one that loops.
In terms of both of our considerations as to how implementation of certain policies will actually affect the wildlife. And just in saying this, like when a shopping center is going to be put up, or a parking lot, or a farm, or whatever it is, generally, at least here in America, I don't know how it is on your side of the pond, but generally you have to go in search of and acquire something like an environmental impact report. So when you hire a team of professionals that goes in and sees, well, if you put this here, is anything going to be pushed to the brink of extinction or endangered, or are you going to be, causing any type of major, massive bad ecological impact? Now, and you see the detriment of countries that don't abide by this. Look at what Dubai has done to their coastland with their, manifestation of those crazy, stupid palm trees out in the ocean. And they basically just stagnated and ruined a whole chunk of coastline because of a lack of recognition of the implementation of some of their policies and plans.
I'm trying to figure out what this has to do with
anything. Can you concede or possibly see from a vegan framework that there could be instances. There could be instances that could manifest where, just by the implementation of the
Okay,
vegan
sure.
lifestyle at
Like,
large, some extra animal
sure, there could be
suffering
there could
occur,
be an unexpected consequence. Now what?
whether indirectly or
Doesn't matter.
directly.
It doesn't matter.
Of course, there are some levels of uncertainty, but let's focus on what we do have certainty of. For instance, a lot of people may not be aware that there's a subsection of the U.S. Department of Agriculture called the Wildlife Services, who regularly place M44s, which are a type of cyanide bomb, across rural America in order to kill wild animals to protect, you guessed it, animal agriculture farmers and ranchers. The presence of animal agriculture
we
is
shouldn't
bad
do
not
that.
just
What does
for
that
the
have to do with
animals that are
veganism?
on those farms, but to the wild animals who are being killed for their protection as well. We can be certain about these things. Of course, large-scale ecological change is something that's largely unpredictable, and therefore we shouldn't hasten to make generalizations about having any kind of knowledge about what particular actions what their effects will be on the ecosystem. But what we do know is that animal agriculture as it currently stands is decimating the ecosystem to the extent that taxpayers in the United States are now paying the government to place cyanide bombs across rural America. I think it's clear that as it stands, the problem is one that needs to be resolved. And the simple answer to resolving that problem at the moment as that stands is to stop funding the animal agriculture that's responsible for its existence.
Well, I feel like there's some sort of kind of hidden presupposition there that wouldn't be happening or wouldn't be implemented.
Do we actually have
for
engagement on
a
this
massive
subject?
amount of farmland? And just to share, I did grow up on a farm. And
Are we
one thing
actually
I can-
going to suggest that
Sure,
that's not a
go ahead.
necessary
So
part
I just
of
wanted
farming?
to
Are we going
address
to talk
that
about it?
substitution off the bat. I mean, I just said that the reason why these cyanide bombs are being placed across rural America is to protect animals in the animal agricultural industry. So if the animals were in that animal agricultural industry, then yes, that wouldn't be happening.
Yeah, and
Well,
also
no,
if we
but I'm
use
saying
different
it does
means of
happen and
protecting
would
them, then it
happen,
wouldn't
just not
happen. Like, what the
necessarily
fuck?
that exact way, but it would happen with farmland. And the issue is that whenever you farm anything, there's always generally, at least certainly as I've found, something
There's always
in
generally.
the environment or the ecosystem that's going to want to prey on whatever you're farming. If you have small ground crops, it's generally rabbits or ground squirrels or gophers. If it's, orchard crops like apples and oranges, you're dealing with birds or, ravens or something like that. And in many instances, farmers not able to create a synergy with whatever is inside this ecosystem has to overcome it and kill it, or else the crops aren't tenable. What happens, and if you don't do that, you don't kill it, but you continue to cultivate the crops, the pests
I wonder if there's a way you could do
overpopulate
farming that
because you're
doesn't
not
require
keeping them in
them
check.
to kill these
And then
pests,
the land
but also
basically
still
becomes
provides enough. I don't
untenable
know.
because the pests are so plentiful. The farmers pull out of the land and don't use it, and then all the animals slowly die off and suffer and starve. So,
okay, so you would agree then that the best thing we can do is to minimize the extent to
well,
which
this was my point.
reducing
This
such
was
harms.
this was my key point. Is that, I mean, do we really know that 1 acre of farmland of ranch land is ultimately less animal suffering than 1 acre of farmland?
No, we're doing suffering math.
Or
No,
1 acre
no,
of
no. I
wild
knew we
land.
were gonna get here.
Like,
Look,
have we
there's
necessarily crunched the numbers
12
to know
cow
that
suffering
this
units,
environment, other
but maybe
than
there are only
being
9
used for the
rabbit
cultivation of
suffering units.
livestock
God
is
damn it.
absolutely, or at least plausibly, because I mean, if you have 1 acre of land that a cow can graze in, and say we're being generous and we want nice happy cows, and we're going to give them a whole acre each cow, how much of that is used, for that one suffering cow, which is now just around that one suffering cow that would be used for millions of suffering insects and mice and gophers and rodents and stuff like that. I guess like where do we draw the line of this one suffering cow is prioritized over the suffering of hundreds of millions of other potentially smaller but sentient
This,
creatures?
by the way,
I guess
part of
that's
the problem with this, like, obviously it's like kind of silly, but then like, okay, what's the problem with the argument? One of them, at a minimum, is that is like the means that we get here, right? They would lose these animals would lose access to what they normally had access to because we were doing a thing we didn't need to be doing. It's basically saying, well, we've done a thing long enough that there are ecosystems built on top of us doing this bad thing, so we should keep doing it. Well, no, that doesn't justify doing the bad thing we're doing. Maybe that just means that ending that ending that practice requires us to make accommodations so that we have less of these problems. Maybe you scale it down slowly so that these populations merely don't produce as much offspring because they are unsupported, and there's less suffering in that way. It doesn't. If you stop doing it all at once, cold turkey, which no one is suggesting, maybe there could be a problem, but that doesn't mean like, well, I guess we just got to keep doing the bad thing. This is kind of like the issue with an argument that comes up with reparations of like, well, it's becoming harder and harder to figure out who reparations should be paid to and how, and it becomes more and more money. And so it's been too long to do it. It's like, well, no, it only gets harder from here, and not doing it could be. I think I haven't thought enough about reparations to like really. I think I would generally agree that with reparations, so I'll just take that position here. But like, okay, well, we're doing a bad thing by not paying reparations, and continuing to do it is not justified because it's gotten too much harder because we have done this bad thing for so long. Obviously, it would have been better to never have developed this factory farming infrastructure, just like it would have been better to have paid reparations immediately after the Civil War. But that doesn't mean that, oh, it's too late. Like, well, we've already done it, so I guess we got to keep doing it, because no, that doesn't work.
Because, as I say, if we continue to produce farm animals and animal agriculture as it stands, we require both the production of the crops at a larger scale than we'd need to feed the human population, and the killing of the animals.
Well, no, but what I'm saying to part of that, and I'm sorry, I think it might have been missed, is that even if
you get rid of that land,
even in the wild land, there's still animal suffering, just not necessarily one's instigated.
It's okay. We're replacing all that farmland with laser tag and
whatever's in that
it's
land
fine. No harm's being done.
Human territory and suffers and dies anyway. That's what I was kind of.
But I'm not advocating for a system of rewilding by which we turn that land back into
and it doesn't matter. We're back on this. Somehow we're back on. What else?
We don't use the land for
how much longer is in this
agricultural production
in
if we
this
don't
section?
need to if it's going to cause excess animal suffering.
And I guess
there's no way to know when the
Q&A
Q&A starts.
I'd
like to go to the Q&A ideally, but if it keeps being this painful.
For instance, talking about kind of like more organic styles of animal production, such as a cow kind of grazing in a field, I'd direct you to a recent study, very recent, December 2020, it came out just last month, in the journal Nature, co-authored by 3 scientists, who conclusively showed that the environmental damage caused by organic farming is as bad or worse than the environmental impact of traditional agricultural methods. And we haven't even discussed here the absolutely catastrophic effect that animal agriculture is having on the environment. I mean, we can talk directly about how much, literally breeding and killing an animal is harming that animal. But the first victims of the environmental crisis are going to be non-human animals. And the fact that our exploitation of them is also its cause is something of a vicious circle of inhumanity that's difficult to describe how insidious it is that we exploit these animals to such an extent that it's destroying the environment. And the first victims of that environmental crisis are going to be non-human animals. But not just that, but also humans too. You mentioned poorer areas in the world potentially not being able to adopt a vegan diet. And I would rebut that in a multitude of ways. Firstly, by saying that veganism is defined as a minimization to the highest extent practicable of all forms of animal suffering. If you need to eat animal products to survive because of where you are in the world,
we have an answer.
Then you can still eat animal products, minimize the amount that you eat to the highest extent practicable, and still call yourself someone who agrees with the vegan philosophy, but also the environmental damage of the animal agricultural industry that we are propelling into the atmosphere by consuming.
It's weird that it's like kind of an aside and an unrelated point, but like I'm glad we finally got an answer to this question, which I assumed we were going to from the outset, which is that if you're literally unable to, it's fine. It seems that Alex is on board with the idea that if you need to eat meat to live, and you need to eat animal products to get by, sure, just try to minimize the amount that you do that. Cool. And I am in agreement. I don't know that I would call that. So he's careful there not to say that people who still eat meat because they have to, but minimize it, would be vegans. And I would agree with that. I don't think I would be happy to call them vegans. But then we have just kind of this difficulty. I guess it's not I guess it doesn't disprove that veganism is morally obligatory because, again, ought implies can. But finally, we've engaged with any sort of like, okay, well, this is a situation that arises, and like I don't think we'll get other ones, but I'm glad we have that addressed. Of yes, if you literally can't, don't try. You know,
these products is going
or
to
I shouldn't say don't
directly
try,
affect
but
people,
like
especially
do what
living,
you can.
in poverty, to the extent that we have an overdetermination of reasons to stop funding this.
Well, but forgive me, but doesn't that kind of
Q&A should be
seemingly
soon, I think.
undermine your
And we'll stop
core moral philosophy? Because I mean, if you're making the statement that it's kind of this objective moral stance that if you're a human and you're killing an animal, you know, it's like, well, would you think it's okay to kill a human in that particular instance? It's kind of the name the trait type thing of giving that equivocation of animal value and human value. And I can see where you're going with that, but in that instance, it almost seems like you're saying, well, if you can't, you know, manifest any other possibility, it's fine for you to be a cold-blooded, horrible murderer that I judge as objectively morally wrong. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, it almost seems to undermine the
No.
level of, I guess,
Not even a little
potency that you're giving to the moral argument to say that, you know, it's not really objective.
No. Like, so this is the thing that in other circumstances I think could be very clear to people. We think killing is wrong. Most people, I think that's rather uncontroversial to say. Killing other people is wrong, and you can say like, okay, well then you shouldn't do it, and it would be morally obligatory not to. Okay, but like if someone's trying to kill you and you kill them in self-defense, most people would think that's fine. And you say, what? In some circumstances, you're allowed to kill someone? Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, when your life is weighed against someone else's, I think it's reasonable, morally speaking, for a person to value their own and to defend themselves in that way. And I think most people would agree. I think Smokey Saint would likely agree, and that shines a light of like, okay, well, clearly we don't. These rules aren't so hard and fast that a person should be morally obligated to sacrifice their own life to keep to them. And so it stops. It doesn't become this weird exclusion to say, well, if you can't, if you can't eat a fully vegan diet, it's fine. If you as long as you minimize the amount that you eat animal products. That's not a contradiction in any way.
It has certain environmental factors that make it morally permissible, and
Well,
maybe you can explore that.
Yeah, like with most things.
Yeah, the operative word there is almost undermined. I'm afraid it doesn't for a variety of reasons. Firstly,
Yeah.
even if you're proposing some kind of objective theory of ethics, taking practical considerations into account to decide how it should actually be applied to.
And by the way, like now that Alex has mentioned the objective theory of ethics, yeah, it does feel a little bit like internet skeptic brain of yeah, like well, if it doesn't apply to everything, then it can't work at all. It's like no. Like these ethical considerations are often malleable. You're not going to have like an objective one rule, like one sentence rule that defines all morality, or okay, killing is bad, therefore there are no exceptions. No, it's when possible, when you can, these are things that you should or should not do. If you literally can't, ought implies can. We're back to it. But this is the kind of nuance that gets left aside with, like I said, like internet skeptic thinking.
Somebody's life in no way undermines the objectivity of that moral case. If we agreed that it was objectively morally wrong to kill an innocent person, we might want to
example.
at least readdress that problem when it comes to 4 people starving on a desert island. Will only survive for the amount of time it'll take to get rescued.
I didn't expect like the Donner Party example to get any sort of address. Like I wouldn't expect him. I expect the debate to get here. This was the kind of thing where I'm like, I'm gonna have this example, but obviously he'll never respond because I didn't say it to him. I said it at his video, but he's kind of alluding to a similar type thing. Desert on an island. Maybe it is acceptable to do. Like I'm curious where he'll. I don't know. Maybe he'll flesh it out. I don't know. It sounds like he's not going to address whether he thinks it would be right or wrong to start cannibalizing people. But it's like see what I mean? He's very capable of engaging with these subjects in a very in a very nuanced and intelligent way of considering examples that prompt tough questions, and yet his opening was just utterly devoid of any of the like of the majority of the intelligence I would expect from him.
One of them gets killed. We may still agree that it's a wrong thing to do, but we can recognize that it would at least need a reevaluation based on practical considerations. That doesn't undermine the objectivity of the moral principle.
Yeah, he's living it pretty vague as to what his answer to
let me
that
try
would
to put
be,
it a slightly
which it's
different
fine.
way.
It's not necessary here.
Let's and forgive me for it being a little bit sloppy here, but like say from your perspective of the moral positioning that you're presenting, and certainly through the name the trait argument, if you had a retard and a chicken.
Whoa, okay, hold
on. It was going to come down to a decision to eat one or the other for survival. Then is it essentially fine to say, well, it doesn't really matter which one you choose because each is morally atrocious equally?
Whoa.
I think that that word kind of having lost all of its medical significance. I'm not entirely.
Oh, sorry.
Sure
okay.
exactly
Let's say. Okay. Sorry. let's say someone.
I think Alex could have just been like, okay, I think what you're meaning to say is like, is there a moral equivalence between like sufficiently. Well, I don't even want to say sufficiently unintelligent people. Like maybe like, is there a moral equivalence between animals and people, right? Even if the person isn't the word he used. No matter who the person is there an equivalence? I don't think the God damn, like just toss the bomb into it. Just throw it in there. All right.
Almost considered as near vegetative state or capable of the level of rational reasoning that you'd attribute to maybe a smart parrot, that type of thing. And then you have a chicken. And is it then, I guess, to say it's just morally equivalent, it's a wash as to which one you would kill in order to eat to survive?
No. The name the trait argument that I presented was specifically in the context of the reason I give a specific example, such as a human being in a gas chamber.
So this is something. So the question that is so inarticulately being asked is there an equivalence of moral consideration that should exist between humans and non-human animals? I think humans generally, at the very least right now, have a bias towards humans over non-humans. In the future, it is very possible, just in the way that it used to be more common for people to have a preference for a particular race over another. Sadly, it is too much still the case. But now that is seen by most to be kind of a backwards way of thinking and something that should be morally abhorrent now. I hope maybe in the future things will progress to a point where animals can be treated with similar moral consideration. Maybe not identical, like maybe in the same way that if you're too young as a human you can't vote, maybe chickens shouldn't get votes. But at the very least, as far as thinking it's more okay to kill one than another, maybe in the future that won't be the case anymore, and we will be condemned for our backwards thinking, and I think that would be really nice if that occurs. At the moment, it's pretty reasonable for people to prefer humans to non-humans. You'd be pretty hard-pressed to ethically justify that, but it doesn't really matter. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to talk about that justification a little bit, but yeah, I don't really have a good answer for it.
Because you need to take the example into account. There are morally relevant differences that can determine whether or not one species is worth more than another, or indeed if one person you determine is worth more than another. The question is, are they worth more to the extent that we have the right to kill them? Now the point I would raise here is to say that in the situation we're in, whereby we don't need to kill these animals to survive, we can say that a pig has less moral worth than a human being because of a multitude of morally relevant factors. But because we're not in a situation where one of them has to be killed, none of those differences are morally relevant when it comes.
This is a phenomenal argument. I think he wasn't quite done, so I'm sorry. But I am so glad we're getting some really good arguments. This is great. It doesn't matter. I'll admit that
that humans have are deserving of more moral consideration than non-humans, but it doesn't matter because it's unnecessary. It's unnecessary harm being caused, and that's the problem. That should have been the heart of his argument and the heart of his opening. Instead, we got the screed against factory farms, which is not the same thing as arguments for veganism. This is still only against the mistreatment of animals and the killing of animals, and not the consuming of animal products like milk, eggs, wool. Uh, but like for example, would it be a problem if if all the leather that is ever on the market came from cows who lived a natural life, who were like not bred for this purpose, just like maybe even born in the wild, lived a natural life, died of natural causes, and then just like, well, it's here, we might as well use it to make leather. Would that be necessarily bad? I don't necessarily think so. But I would assume the vegan position would be that is bad. But I'm not exactly sure, and I'm just glad we got an argument like this. It reminds me a little bit of one concept we haven't gotten to yet, which is the kinds of arguments, the counter arguments that exist. This is I guess this I think might be what we would call a negation. Just we are. I'll do this briefly. I'm not going to go over all of them, but this would be an instance of um, we can actually maybe it's not even negation. I'm gonna reappraise. I'm gonna off stream reevaluate what these like the definitions of these, because it's been long enough that I'm not confident as to not confident enough to authoritatively define them. But basically, what he's saying in this argument is it doesn't matter whether that's true or not. We're still causing unnecessary suffering, even if you think it's less morally relevant than human suffering.
Comes to the justification for forcing one into a gas chamber. But if you're in a situation of necessity, then those moral
finally we're getting some good arguments.
In other
an
words,
hour into the debate.
In the same way that you might determine on a desert island that one person is more deserving of life than another, if you had to kill one of them, not even on a desert island, because some people think you shouldn't kill either, but if you were forced, on pain of some kind of horrible moral atrocity, to choose to kill one person or another. Suppose one is like an elderly person who's going to die next week anyway, and the other is a young, promising mathematician who is working towards a cure for cancer. You might decide that when push comes to shove, you have to value the extrinsic worth of the second person. You have to take that into account, because although the intrinsic worth might be the same, you might have extrinsic factors to say that that person's worth more than the other. But the moment we leave that situation, the moment we place ourselves in the real world, the actual amount of difference by which one is morally worth more than the other may be this much or this much or this much. But if this is the scale we're talking about, if humans are here and pigs are here, and maybe rats are here or whatever, the where they would have to be in order to justify what we're doing to them in the real world would be, well, on this scale, my hand would be in North America, across the ocean.
Okay. I don't love the conclusion of that argument, but otherwise, really, really good argument. It doesn't matter about the moral consideration, the relative moral consideration. It's unnecessary suffering, and that's bad. This is what it's what he should have been talking about the whole time.
Skip a thought. Could you almost agree to this following statement? At some instances, or maybe objectively, maybe for the sake of this argument, the only difference in trait between the animal and the human is whatever subjective value we have placed on them.
I'm not sure what he's asking here.
I think so. I'm not entirely sure I understand your question.
Well, because
me neither, Alex.
If you ultimately decide, like in the real world, that subjectively the animal has this level of equivalent value, yet in the hypothetical world it's different. Does that not kind of lead to an idea that based upon environmental circumstances, the value you attribute could change, and therefore is by matter of nature subjective? And therefore the only trait that really separates these things in our mind, whether the vegan or the meat eater, is just whatever subjective value we have attributed to them, and that is the only difference in the trait.
Is he just like
feasible?
Is this just going to be like a rant against
I wouldn't say so,
subjectivity? Is
because
that what he's
I'm
getting
working on a
to?
system of minimization of suffering here, which is to say, and there again,
I think
we
that's where
haven't
he's
opened up the
going.
meta-ethical discussion of why that should be valued. That's probably too difficult or too long, at least, a conversation to have
I would tend
under
to
this
agree.
format.
That's a
What I
good
would say is
approach.
that once we agree that that is an admirable goal, and there could be different reasons for thinking
And if you
so.
disagree,
Somebody
we
might
can talk
be,
about that, but
Sam
then we
Harris
shouldn't be
might say
having
that
this
it's just
debate.
a priori true that suffering is bad. I would disagree, but for whatever reason we arrive at that point, if we say that suffering is bad, then we can now talk objectively about what's actually going to minimize suffering. So if we know, for instance, that a
It's a
human
really good
being is
approach from Alex.
capable
See what I
of
mean? He's a really
planning for the
smart
future
guy.
and a level of sociability and social connection that would cause considerably more suffering for himself and for the rest of his society if he were killed than it would do a pig, then we can say that perhaps that morally relevant consideration grants the human being more moral worth than the pig does. But it doesn't grant them so much more that they can do as they please to the pig.
Interesting. Interesting. This has really been incredibly pleasurable, and I very much appreciate your competence as a debater, Alex. This has been a wonderful time. I was hoping to kind of carry into a slightly different metaphysical level, if you don't mind. And James, I don't know how much time we have here.
That's a great question. How much time do we have here?
We only have about, on the exact timer, about 2 minutes.
Okay,
So we're almost done with this
then this
portion.
should
I
be
think I'm
pretty
going to
quick.
skip the Q&A.
Alex, I just
as
wanted
per
to
usual.
pick your brain on this one. And I don't know, maybe you have an idea on terms of any specific data you've looked at that leads us to believe that the type of suffering that many species of fish experience is, equivalent levels of suffering that other animals experience, and therefore if that has any catalyst effect in consideration.
I am
of there
highly
being
disinterested in
ample
this kind of
prey for
conversation.
society.
I really
and
hope
number
he doesn't get into
two,
it.
just to kind of lead off of that, is your thoughts of a vegan lifestyle where veganism, the abstinence of animal products, is the ultimate goal and desire and high virtue. What in the instance where perhaps animal products are grown or lab manufactured without
we're actually
any
going to talk about
potential
synthetic meats. He's probably not
of
going to have an issue with it.
animal suffering, actual, sentient suffering at all in order to produce it? Would you be okay with that type of product being
I would also
part
argue
of
that is
society?
a vegan. That would be vegan because
Sure,
for what it's worth. Before we let him answer, I would argue that eating synthetic meats is eating vegan. It's not that it's not the meat eating that makes it not vegan. It's that it is not an animal product that makes it. It's being an animal product that would make it not vegan. So something to note there. I think a vegan could eat synthetic meats and still be vegan.
Well, I'll happily answer these questions. And James, I know I said about time constraints, but I'm happy to just basically go for as long as this takes, because I also want to ask you one more question in return.
Beautiful.
Since
Sure.
most of them have been directed at me so far. On the first point about fish, our best evidence suggests that fish are capable of feeling pain. It's a difficult thing to quantify, of course, and so it's difficult to talk about whether they kind of feel more or less pain than certain other animals. What we do know is that they feel enough pain that our unnecessary destruction of them is unjustified, and it's not just the fish.
This is something that that's all long sat in the back of my mind when watching people fish, and like you take it out of the water and it just like flops around. It's like it's suffocating to get. It's not just that it's dying. It's a horrifying way to die, and like you're just watching it do it. Like watching people like fish individually feels viscerally really disturbing to me. Like I don't know, that's just been like a thing for myself personally of like they're literally suffocating together. There's not even a pretense of trying to end their life quickly or humanely. It's just no, when you can't breathe anymore, that's it. It'd be the equivalent of us drowning. That's it's pretty horrifying.
That we kill for food, but also collateral damage. The methods of fishing that are used to produce the obscene numbers, and it's genuinely unthinkable the level of fish that are being killed, even in comparison to factory farmed land-based animals. It's not just a consideration of the fish that are being killed, but also the fact that when they scrape the seabed to try and find the fish that they're after and the sea life that they're after, there are untold levels of collateral damage, which is a complete waste of life, but also a destruction to the ecosystem. The environmental damage of fishing should be bad enough to convince people to go vegan on that front, even if the animal suffering argument doesn't do it for them. Fully 1/2 of the 79,000 tons of ocean plastic in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch are fishing nets. Fishing nets, 50%, right? Fishing is
That's
destroying
wild.
the ocean, not just in terms of the suffering of fish, but in terms of the environmental impact as well. That would answer that would be how I would respond to your first question. On the second point about lab-grown meat, veganism is about a minimization of animal suffering. So if no animals suffer in the production of some kind of product, then yeah, you can do as you please to it. I couldn't really care less what you decide to eat, and most people don't. A lot of people think that vegans care about what people eat. I mean, I really don't. Every time somebody posts an Instagram photo of their latest dish, I just couldn't care less. What we care about is whether there was any suffering necessitated by getting it onto your plate. Now, the one thing I would say, however,
I think it's
is
a
that
really
although I
important
think that
point to
lab-grown meat
stress.
is fine and an exciting prospect and something we should be looking forward to, it should not be seen as a reason to not go vegan yet. For someone who says, well, look, I understand all the arguments you're making, but I'm not going to go vegan until lab-grown meat gives me the exact same experience. I don't think people who say this understand how sinister they sound. It's a means of saying, listen, I know that animals are being tortured. They're being forced into gas
Even some of
chambers.
his
They're being
mannerisms remind me
separated
of
from their
Hitchens.
children. They're being crushed in bags to suffocate or ground up alive. But you know, the taste just doesn't quite do it for me. And it's maybe 80% there, the vegan alternative, 90% there, but it doesn't quite do it for me. It's insidious. If all vegan food tasted absolutely disgusting, we'd still have an obligation to eat it, because taste pleasure is never a consideration when it comes to the infliction of torture
Another really good
upon
argument.
an innocent creature. And so even if it tasted horrible, we'd still have an obligation to eat it. So aren't we lucky that we live in a world where it doesn't taste horrible? And yes, lab-grown meat will be another wonderful, tasty alternative. But for somebody who's waiting for that to arrive, I pity the conversation they'll have to have with their grandchildren when they say, I know that you lived in a time where you could have perfectly healthily abstained from this animal cruelty and you chose not to. Why? Because the food just wasn't quite nice enough. It's like, forgive me for not taking these people ethically seriously. But look, I want an opportunity to ask you one question. The thing is, it kind of opens the door into a whole new subject of discussion. But I would at least
It really
ask
does,
you
but
to,
I don't want to keep at this
considering
for so
the
long.
fact
Jeez.
that things like soy production destroying the environment, and around 75% of the soy that we grow is fed to livestock. So it's not just red meat that's bad for the environment, but 50% of the soy that we grow for livestock is fed to chicken, so white meat as well. And the soy that's grown for human consumption is only about 6% of the soy that's grown is actually consumed by humans, and that soy is grown in other areas of the world like North America and Europe. The stuff that's destroying the rainforest is grown for animal consumption. Also, the UK, I don't know what it's like for the US, but the UK imports 1.83 million tons of soy per year for livestock, which destroys 900,000 hectares of land in the process. And every single one of those.
Does that make people who are like proud carnivores and like anti-vegan in principle, does that make them soy boys? Something to consider.
Hectares
I'm just
emits
being silly, obviously.
3.67 tons of carbon dioxide into the environment. The fact that 63% of the world's arable land is being used for livestock, despite the fact that animal products only provide about 18% of our caloric intake worldwide, the fact that 20 times more water is required to produce 1 pound of beef than 1 pound of starchy root vegetables, the fact that 2,000 gallons of water is needed for 1 pound of beef and 1,000 gallons for a pound of milk, the fact that worldwide 14 to 80% of all greenhouse emissions are due to livestock production, and that methane.
I wish it wasn't coming in the form of what feels like a filibuster at the end, or just like a cavalcade. Like, it is relevant, the environmental impact. It's a little, no, it's on topic, but yeah, I wish it wasn't like, it didn't feel like, oh, we're just running along in the conversation portion so you can just lay out all this stuff. I keep pausing at really unflattering frames of just everybody. I guess this is why Smokey Saint is smarter than all of us with his avatar there, because he can't do that.
Which is a particular problem of the animal agricultural industry, is 34 times worse a greenhouse gas than CO2 on the scale of a century.
This
and on
should
the
have been
scale
in
of
this
2 decades,
intro. This would be a
86
good
times
reason
more.
to argue for
And
veganism.
also
Like, look at the
ocean,
environmental impact.
destruction that I mentioned a moment ago. Would you agree that animal agriculture
And like laying out
is
all these facts would be
decimating the environment, and that should
less
provide us
weird
with
there.
at least some incentive to abstain from funding it?
Well, this mild problem I have with that is I think it could very, very easily be said that just human presence is destroying the environment. Even in instances where humans have decided to create preserves and places that are supposed to be, basically bastions of a minimization of animal suffering, there's still almost an intrinsic requirement of occasional human interference to try and mitigate what could be cataclysmic ecosystem events that are even caused by peripheral causes of human civilization. So it almost, to me, at a certain level, feels like we might be splitting hairs on some of it. Now, here's what again, I haven't looked at a lot of the references that you're specifically citing for the decrease in land production for the cultivation of the animals, but I'll go ahead and concede it for you. The issue that I have, again, is just, I guess, what follows is this automatic assumption that whatever that land is ultimately used for,
No, it doesn't
being
matter.
from
God damn
farm
it. We're
production
back
or
on
animal
this?
agriculture,
This is the
is
third time, and
definitively
he's
and
already been
essentially
told it
with
doesn't matter.
confidence believed to going to be supplanted by an environment of less animal suffering.
Nope.
And so
we can
I guess
assume
this
it's
is where,
just, well, yeah, less
and I
animal
don't
suffering.
think I
Yeah.
haven't seen
Okay.
anything that really has done any level of work to say definitively one side or the other because of what I
All
had
right,
said.
I'm gonna address it again. Let's assume that it was replaced with something that caused the same amount of animal suffering, but not done by humans. At the very least, we wouldn't be doing something harmful. And like, if there's the same amount of harm, maybe we could take action to alleviate some of that. That said, you'd have to do a lot of work to suggest that it's the same. And for what it's worth, it doesn't matter. The only thing that we should be trying to prove is whether it's morally obligatory. And if there are problems with implementation, that's the problem. That's a problem that needs to be solved. That doesn't change whether it's morally obligatory or not.
Earlier, there are lots of, I think, secondary and third potential ramifications that aren't necessarily considered. And yeah, like you look at a problem like you bring up of the nets in the ocean. That's atrocious, and that's a problem. It's the same thing with the factory farms. I personally don't like the fact that the culture and the environment has
finally going to get a good response to the factory farm bit?
production of meat, which I believe personally is the catalyst to the mistreatment of animals. What was, and I think you would argue, or maybe even I would hope at least agree, the humans who were farmers 200 years ago, who were just raising animals for their own sustenance and benefit.
James in the background be like, hey, can we hurry this up? We're like already way over time. I told you 2 minutes, and then y'all went on like, hey, let's just introduce like a million other topics and go on at length citing statistics.
Do anything ethically wrong
Poor James.
By your standards. But once they progressed to a level where they could do something different, then all of a sudden the moral obligation existed.
Yeah, and we're in that situation right now. I would ask you, because you speak...
So this is where there's a little bit of like a hiccup of putting a lot of the onus on the consumer when it's a systemic problem, because Alex pretty clearly laid out that on a systemic and global scale, it is not necessary for humans to eat meat. But then it's the burden of that is put at the feet of like, well, you're funding this every time you buy it from the grocery store. Well, the like, in a way, yes, but more accurately, no. More accurately, it's a systemic problem that needs systemic solutions. And we're getting a little bit of caught up here, right? This is where Smokey is like, okay, well, now we're happy to talk about what's possible. It's like, well, it is globally possible. It just seems like he wasn't talking about global solutions because of how Alex decided to present the moral problem.
Quite movingly about the terrible conditions in which animals are kept, and seem to imply that you wish it would come to an end. I would just ask you, are you somebody who pays for these products?
Yes, I do. Yes. And even an extent for as much as I could even try to say, well, I could mitigate the purchase of pigs and beef. Which, and by the way, let me tell you this. If I knew there was a local family farm that I could support that produced slightly more expensive but animals that were cared for and open free range
I
and
like
had
to note that this weighs in what we just heard weigh in on the subject that kind of feels like it's in the background. He mentioned if it was slightly more expensive. Expense is a thing that factors into all of this. On top of everything is the background noise of you have to be able to afford it, and uh, and this is where incentives of the system that exists of commodification, of profit motive, of being able to survive, being contingent on having enough money, it kind of leads to the situations that Alex rightfully has a problem with. And I wonder to what extent he would agree with this being a problem of capitalism and just doesn't want to mention it, or how much he might disagree. Like I said, I don't know if he's a socialist or capitalist or whatever else.
had a better quality of life, I would happily and gladly and quickly support that manufacturer and hope that doing so would starve out a large, cruel factory
I mean, it
farm
won't.
type of environment.
You can
Yes.
hope
Well,
that, but it
I'm
won't.
glad to hear that, but until one arises, do you not think you have an obligation to abstain from an industry which you self-admittedly say is a moral abomination?
Well, in the sense
That's a good
that
question.
I don't believe
Press him a
there's
little bit.
another optimal option, in
What do you mean
terms of like,
optimal
say, for
option? What the
instance,
fuck?
even just to the level of pets. Let me take it to that. Um, Pets, I know there is a concern of having, particularly cats and dogs, which are heavily, protein ridden. In fact, I specifically go to look for food that is as natural and free of byproducts for my cats at all. That's one of those things to me that, for the sake of wanting the higher quality of
Bless
life
you,
for
James.
my cats who are intimately connected to me, I have attributed a higher value of them than the general pig byproduct that produced their food.
Okay,
So
but look, this is an irrelevancy. My question is a fairly simple one. Disregarding things like pets, if you think that the factory farming animal agricultural industry as it exists right now is morally wrong,
right.
and yet you pay for it to continue, would you not see that as a moral inconsistency on your part?
So this is like a push towards like kind of boycott, which just tends not to work. I agree that like it is in as much as possible reducing the demand can reduce the amount of harm being done here. It's just a matter of like the approach I think needs to be more systemic and we address it on an individual level. While I agree that individuals have a responsibility in this regard, we do kind of the same thing with environmentalism where we say, okay, you shouldn't use straws anymore. But ultimately, the problem tends to be on a more systemic level where a huge amount of waste and pollution is caused by things that are outside of an individual's control. Sure, they're not being done for no reason. It's not like these companies that produce all these plastics and whatnot do it for no reason. There is a demand for their products, but part of what's built into that is they're incentivized to do things in as cheap a way as possible to maximize profit. And that's why the the externality of climate catastrophe comes about. Ultimately, the problem is systemic. Even if I'm not comfortable blaming, or even if I'm not comfortable saying that the consumer is without their own impact, you could choose to do things that would reduce your impact, but that's not going to solve the problem either.
no, because I don't see that the contrary solution of the position right now is necessarily objectively morally virtuous. I think it has arguments that it presents to
Okay,
deal
so
with some of
hold on.
this.
Sorry, you're saying simultaneously that by funding animal agriculture, we're doing something wrong, but somehow it's not the case that by not funding that industry, we're doing something.
Well, what I'm saying is that we're assuming that whatever we did that wasn't animal agriculture on that land wouldn't be worse. We're making a massive assumption.
No,
And I mean,
God
even if
damn
you
it,
look at it,
stop
look at
with
it through this
this.
lens, just real quickly, because this is kind of how I'm looking at it too. Just because we don't see or cause the animal suffering doesn't mean it's there. It's not there. So if you have a piece of wild land that's not touched by humans, there's still animals suffering there. I mean,
Yeah, and you have the choice.
But
when
we're
you go
not
into a
causing that
supermarket
suffering, right? There's
to
a
either
difference
pay for the
between,
product which
like, something to note, like, is there a difference between a person dying and a person being killed? Yeah, there's a difference, and that's what we're talking about here.
necessitated that kind of animal suffering to grow a lot of crops to then feed an animal which then suffered, which was then killed for you to eat. Or you have the option to buy the crops directly. And it should be blindingly obvious that the latter option is the ethical obligatory thing to do.
We do have to jump into the Q&A pretty
Yes,
quick here because we have a lot of
this.
questions. So if you guys are ready for it, we do
I'll
have...
concede it. I'm a moral monster. It's okay. Yeah.
That's not even what he's saying.
Not to be flippant at it or something, and I hope you understand, Alex. I have a strong appreciation for where your positioning is coming from and the amount of knowledge that you have on it. I do just wonder in a level of, and this partially probably does have to do with my personal
Smokey,
world.
This has to be extremely concise because we
Sorry,
have
real
a
quick.
ton of questions, so like 20 seconds.
Okay. I just wonder about certain secondary and third dynamics that aren't necessarily always crunched in terms of these arguments. But I know with that, I'll yield.
Okay, we're gonna skip the Q&A. I think I've gone over before why it's not super helpful as far as like debate analysis. Oh my God, this was much worse than I thought it was going to be. Alex's opening in particular, he is capable of so much more, and we saw through the debate that he's able to wrestle with a lot of the things that I was mentioning at the outset. He's clearly able to thinking of them, but then it's just a focus on factory farms as though that were the only possible way of having animal products. I'm sure, like he even mentioned that he would have an issue with eating meat that didn't come from a factory farm. So clearly that's not the only problem. Why is that the focus? Like, I get the focus, the problem is the suffering caused, and that's a problem. But if factory farming was done more ethically, he would still have a problem with it. So why are we pretending like that's the sole source of these issues? Ultimately, as far as where my position has moved throughout this debate, it has moved a little bit. I am more convinced than when I began about vegetarianism, about minimizing, I mean, maybe you can call it veganism, like minimizing the consumption of animal products in general, but like eating meat, I think is definitely wrong if you do not need to. I am less convinced about animal products, things like milk, eggs, and wool, so long as they are so long as they are ethically sourced. If you just have a couple of chickens as pets and you eat their eggs, I don't think there's a problem with that. Same thing with if you have a pet cow and you drink its milk, and wool is often... Again, I don't know if vegans have a problem with wool. It's just one that keeps coming up to my mind. In as much as it's possible, obviously, it's good to reduce suffering in the world. And if you don't need to consume animal products to survive, then you would be better off not doing it. Maybe that's not the case with animal products, but it's definitely the case with meat. So I hope we all had something to think about. I was surprised at the direction this debate went. I will be honest with that. It was kind of a lot to get through, especially for how non-interactive the arguments were, how much they were talking past each other, and how bad some of these arguments were to begin with. We didn't really even talk about the full philosophical or ethical justifications for things very much. We got to it eventually, but very, very little. And oh my God, Smokey, what the land would be used for instead just does not matter. It just doesn't. And I think we went over that enough times. So with that said, thank you all for watching. I did do things a little bit differently today, as you might have noticed. I didn't have the 15 minutes of starting soon screen. I usually just started my stream early so people could shuffle in. Not that there's like an audience to shuffle in. I'm gonna try just doing the scheduled broadcast so that for the purpose of the VODs being a little cleaner. Let me know if there's if you have opinions on that. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.